The story of the Israelites begins not with a nation, but with a wandering family whose origins are preserved in traditions that blend memory, myth, and historical echoes of the ancient Near East. The figure of Abraham emerges as the founding ancestor, remembered as having left the city of Ur or perhaps Haran to travel toward an unknown land under the call of a divine promise. In the texts that preserve his memory, Abraham is not described as a king or city builder, but as a pastoral chieftain moving with his flocks across the landscapes of Canaan, the Negev, and the fringes of Mesopotamia. This distinctive portrayal already sets the Israelites apart from the civilizations that surrounded them. Where Sumerians, Akkadians, and Egyptians left behind monumental temples and inscriptions proclaiming the deeds of their rulers, the Israelite memory opens with tents pitched under oak groves, wells dug in contested lands, and altars built from simple stones to mark encounters with the divine. Archaeology places this narrative world in the context of the Middle Bronze Age, roughly between 2000 and 1500 BCE, when populations of West Semitic-speaking pastoralists moved through the Levant. These groups, often referred to in Egyptian texts as Habiru or Shasu, occupied marginal lands, working as herders, mercenaries, and sometimes raiders, existing on the edge of the great settled powers. Abraham's story reflects the life of these semi-nomadic peoples, dependent on kinship networks, alliances with local rulers, and careful negotiation of survival between desert and sown field. The memory of migration from Mesopotamia toward Canaan may echo real population movements during this period when Amorite-speaking tribes spread westward, gradually assimilating into local cultures but also retaining distinctive traditions of ancestry and divine relationship. The figure of Abraham is most significant for the covenant he is said to have received. In this covenant, the deity promises land, descendants, and blessing, forming the theological cornerstone of Israelite identity. Unlike the contracts and treaties found in Hittite or Assyrian archives that bound vassals to powerful kings, this covenant is framed as a relationship between a transcendent God and a wandering herdsman. It is sealed through rituals of sacrifice and marked physically through the practice of circumcision, setting Abraham's descendants apart from surrounding peoples. The repeated reaffirmation of this promise through successive generations in the narratives of Isaac and Jacob suggests that memory of divine election became central to the self-understanding of the Israelite community long before they were recognized as a nation. Isaac, the son born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, occupies a quieter place in the tradition. His role is less about conquest or covenant-making and more about continuity. He reopens wells, reaffirms treaties, and experiences the same conflicts with local rulers that his father had faced. The traditions concerning Isaac emphasize stability and inheritance, reinforcing the idea that the divine promise was not a singular event, but a continuous thread passed down through generations. Isaac's life bridges the daring migration of Abraham with the more turbulent career of Jacob, linking the beginning of the family story to the development of its tribal identity. Jacob, later renamed Israel, embodies the struggles and transformations that characterize the emerging people. His narrative is filled with conflict, rivalry with his brother Esau, tension with his uncle Laban, and a mysterious wrestling encounter with a divine being at the Jabbok River. Each conflict reflects the precarious existence of a people forming its identity among larger and often hostile neighbours. Jacob's marriages to Leah and Rachel and his relationships with their maidservants lead to the birth of 12 sons, who become the symbolic ancestors of the 12 tribes. The tradition of Jacob wrestling until dawn and receiving a new name captures the essence of Israelite identity. Not a straightforward inheritance of land and power, but a contested and hard-won destiny that comes through persistence, struggle, and divine encounter. Archaeologists have long debated whether the patriarchal stories preserve historical memories, or whether they are purely literary creations of later Israelite communities. Excavations in Canaan reveal settlement patterns burial customs and nomadic incursions during the Middle Bronze Age that resemble the social world depicted in the patriarchal traditions. Yet direct evidence of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob remains elusive, as expected for semi-nomadic clans without monumental inscriptions. Instead, the value of these traditions lies in how they reflect the memory of a people who define themselves not by great cities or empires, but by kinship ties, covenantal promises, and a distinct relationship with their God. The geography of the patriarchal stories is deeply embedded in the land of Canaan. Abraham builds altars at Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, and Beersheba, marking a sacred geography that later Israelites would recognize as their heartland. Jacob dreams of a ladder reaching to heaven at Bethel, a place that becomes central to later worship. The purchase of the cave of Machpelah in Hebron as a burial site anchors the family's memory in the land, providing both a legal and symbolic claim to Canaan long before the conquest traditions. These stories transform ordinary landscapes, wells, fields, caves, into sacred markers of identity, ensuring that memory of divine encounters is tied to specific places across the land. The figure of Joseph, Jacob's favoured son, extends the narrative beyond Canaan into Egypt. Sold into slavery by his brothers, Joseph rises to power through wisdom and interpretation of dreams, eventually saving both Egypt and his family from famine. Historically, this story resonates with Egyptian records of Semitic groups entering the Nile Delta as labourers, servants, and officials during the Middle and New Kingdom periods. The Hyksos, a group of West Semitic rulers who controlled parts of Egypt in the 17th century BCE, may provide a historical backdrop for memories of Israelites in Egypt. Joseph's story illustrates how divine providence could work even through exile and suffering, preparing the way for the collective memory of Israel's descent into Egypt. The patriarchal narratives also preserve an awareness of cultural interaction with surrounding peoples. Abraham makes treaties with Philistine rulers, negotiates with Hittites, and receives blessing from Melchizedek, the priest-king of Salem. Jacob flees to Aram and marries into Mesopotamian kinship networks. These stories show the Israelites emerging not in isolation, but within a web of interactions across the ancient Near East. The patriarchs are portrayed as foreigners and sojourners, repeatedly described as dwelling in tents and negotiating with established city dwellers. This self-understanding as outsiders would shape Israelite identity throughout their history, reinforcing the idea that their destiny was not rooted in human political structures, but in divine promise. The covenantal theme runs like a thread through the stories of all three patriarchs. For Abraham, it is the initial promise of land and descendants. For Isaac, it is the reaffirmation that the covenant continues. For Jacob, it is the transformation of identity through struggle and the assurance that his offspring will inherit the blessing. The repetition of the promise across generations reinforces its permanence, while the varying circumstances, migration, famine, conflict, exile, demonstrate that the covenant transcends particular moments of crisis. This theological foundation would become essential during later periods of exile and domination, when the Israelites needed assurance that their identity and destiny remained intact despite political upheavals. Archaeological studies of pastoral nomadism in the Levant provide a backdrop for understanding how such traditions could be preserved and transmitted. Semi-nomadic groups moved with their herds across seasonal pastures, forming loose tribal confederations united by ancestry and cultic practices. Their settlements often leave little trace, but their impact can be seen in small rural sites, pottery distributions, and inscriptions that reference West Semitic names. The patriarchal traditions may reflect the oral memories of such groups, preserved and elaborated through centuries of storytelling, until they were committed to writing in the Iron Age when Israel had become a settled nation. The absence of monumental power in these narratives contrasts sharply with the surrounding civilizations, but also reflects historical reality. While Mesopotamian kings erected ziggurats and Egyptian pharaohs raised pyramids, the Israelites remembered their origins in tents and fields. This contrast underscored their distinctiveness and reinforced the theological message that their strength did not come from imperial might, but from covenantal relationship. Even the burial cave at Machpelah stands as a modest symbol of permanence compared to grand royal tombs, emphasizing continuity over grandeur. The patriarchal cycle concludes with Jacob's family migrating to Egypt under Joseph's protection. This movement sets the stage for the next phase of Israelite history, where the small clan of pastoralists transforms into a larger people, whose identity will be forged through oppression, liberation, and covenant renewal. The memory of the patriarchs continues to resonate throughout the later history, serving as the foundation of claims to land, peoplehood, and divine favour. Abraham's migration becomes the archetype of obedience, Isaac's continuity affirms stability, Jacob's struggles embody perseverance, and Joseph's rise in Egypt foreshadows both exile and redemption. These intertwined stories carry the seeds of the entire Israelite experience, preparing the ground for their collective emergence as a nation in the following generations. The memory of the Israelites' descent into Egypt occupies a central place in their history, standing as both a story of survival and the beginning of an experience that would shape their collective identity for generations. The migration begins with a famine in Canaan, a crisis that forced Jacob's family to seek refuge where food and security could be found. Egypt, with its fertile Nile Valley and well-developed system of storage and administration, represented stability in times when the lands of Canaan were struck by drought. The biblical tradition recounts how Joseph, already established as a powerful administrator in Pharaoh's court, provided the bridge that allowed his kin to settle in Egypt rather than perish in the famine. Archaeology and Egyptian records confirm that periods of famine and migration were frequent during the 2nd millennium BCE, and Egypt often received groups of Semitic-speaking peoples from the Levant who sought survival under the protection of the Nile. Joseph's story itself preserves important details about the integration of foreigners into Egyptian society. His rise from slave to high official reflects the reality that Egypt employed many Semites as servants, workers, and even administrators. Tomb paintings from the Middle Kingdom depict West Asiatic traders and herders entering Egypt with their families, donkeys and goods, closely resembling the descriptions of Jacob's household. Papyrus records such as the Brooklyn Papyrus list Semitic slaves with names similar to those later found among the Israelites. These pieces of evidence suggest that the descent into Egypt was not a unique event, but part of a broader pattern of population movement in which the Israelites participated. Yet the survival of this tradition in Israelite memory shows that their migration carried particular significance for their sense of destiny. The land granted to Jacob's family was Goshen, situated in the eastern delta. This region was known for receiving foreign populations, especially those who tended flocks, since it lay on the frontier between Egypt and the Levant. Settlement in Goshen allowed the Israelites to retain elements of their pastoral lifestyle, while also adapting to Egyptian agricultural systems. The coexistence of herding and farming reflected a blending of traditions that would characterize Israelite society throughout its history. While Egypt offered security and prosperity, it also placed the Israelites in the midst of a powerful culture whose language, religion, and administration differed sharply from their own. This dual experience of integration and separation would become a recurring theme, shaping their identity as both participants in and outsiders to the great civilizations around them. Over time, the tradition recounts, the Israelites multiplied in Egypt until they became a significant community. Egyptian concerns about foreign populations in the Delta are well documented, particularly during times of political instability. The Hyksos period, when West Semitic rulers gained control of parts of Egypt, left a lasting suspicion toward Levantine groups. Later pharaohs took measures to control and limit such populations, sometimes imposing corvée labour or restricting their freedom of movement. The biblical memory of Israelites being forced into labour, building store cities like Pithom and Ramses, reflects these realities of state control over immigrant groups. Whether the scale of this oppression matched the later narratives or not, the underlying experience of being a minority under the authority of a powerful state resonated deeply enough to be preserved and transmitted through generations. The descent into Egypt also marked the beginning of a theological transformation. In Canaan, the patriarchs had received promises of land and descendants, but those promises seemed suspended in Egypt, where the family was dependent on foreign rulers. This tension between divine promise and lived reality created the conditions for a new form of faith that emphasized endurance, memory, and hope. The covenant made with Abraham did not dissolve in Egypt. Rather, it became a source of expectation that one day the descendants would return to the land promised to them. In this way, the experience of sojourning in Egypt reinforced the idea that Israelite identity was not merely tied to immediate possession of territory, but to a long-term relationship with their God that transcended temporary circumstances. Egyptian influence on the Israelites during their sojourn cannot be underestimated. The practices of administration, construction, and religious symbolism left impressions that later surfaced in Israelite culture. The very memory of building projects under Egyptian supervision points to exposure to monumental architecture and organized labor systems. Religious motifs, such as the imagery of plagues or the confrontation between divine power and Pharaoh, reflect an intimate knowledge of Egyptian culture and belief. Even the structure of Israelite law codes, which emphasize social justice, liberation, and memory of slavery, may have developed partly in response to the experience of oppression in Egypt. The Israelites defined themselves not only by their ancestral promises, but also by what they had endured under foreign domination. The narrative of Joseph also serves as a bridge between the patriarchal age and the emergence of Israel as a people. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams and provide wisdom to Pharaoh places him in the role of mediator between divine insight and political power. His rise demonstrates how a single individual could preserve his family and secure their survival in a foreign land. Yet the story ends with Joseph's request that his bones be carried back to Canaan, emphasizing that Egypt was never meant to be the final home. This request symbolized the enduring attachment to the land of promise and anticipated the eventual return, even when centuries of residence in Egypt had passed. The Israelites were shaped by Egypt, but they never ceased to understand themselves as destined for another land. Archaeological research into the eastern deltas supports the plausibility of West Semitic groups settling there during the New Kingdom. Excavations at Tel el-Daba, identified with Avaris, the Hyksos capital, reveal extensive evidence of Levantine material culture, including pottery styles and burial customs. Even after the expulsion of the Hyksos, Semitic groups continued to be present in the region as labourers and soldiers. Egyptian texts speak of campaigns against the Shasu of the Levant, while papyri record the movement of herds and people across the frontier. These data confirm that Egypt's relationship with its northeastern neighbours was dynamic, involving both integration and conflict. The Israelite memory of descent into Egypt and eventual oppression aligns with this broader historical context. The formation of Israelite identity during the Egyptian period was not limited to external conditions, but also shaped by internal dynamics. Living as a distinct community within a larger empire required strategies of cultural preservation, genealogies, traditions of ancestry, and rituals of distinction such as circumcision served to maintain cohesion. The stories of the patriarchs continued to circulate, reminding the community of their unique destiny. Over time, these traditions became more than family memories. They were transformed into collective identity markers that distinguished the Israelites from other Semitic groups who entered Egypt, but were absorbed into the local population. The Israelites remembered themselves as chosen, connected to a divine promise, and bound together by shared ancestry and faith. This memory of Egypt, preserved in later generations, became a template for understanding oppression and liberation. When the Israelites faced exile in Babylon centuries later, they drew upon the paradigm of Egypt to interpret their suffering and to anticipate deliverance. Egypt symbolized both bondage and the place where their identity was forged through trial. The duality of Egypt as both refuge in famine and house of slavery reflects the complexity of real historical experiences. The Israelites survived because of Egypt's abundance, but they also discovered who they were by enduring Egypt's power. Their collective memory fused gratitude and resentment, dependence and resistance, producing a narrative that would sustain them through every subsequent challenge. As generations passed, the story of Egypt evolved into a foundational myth of identity. The Israelites were not merely descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were the people who had sojourned in Egypt, suffered oppression, and awaited deliverance. This memory defined them as a community distinct from the Canaanites among whom they would later live. The transition from a small clan to a nation began in Egypt, where they multiplied, preserved their identity, and discovered the enduring meaning of covenant. Egypt provided the crucible in which Israelite identity was tested, strained, and ultimately solidified into something capable of surviving centuries of upheaval. The memory of descent into Egypt thus stands at the threshold between patriarchal origins and national emergence. It marks the point where family traditions expanded into collective history, where stories of individuals became the heritage of a people. The Israelites would carry Egypt with them, not only in their memories of bondage, but in their laws, rituals, and worldview. Egypt was both a place and an idea, a historical experience and a theological symbol. In the generations that followed, the Israelites would leave Egypt, but Egypt would never leave them, shaping their destiny as they moved into the wilderness and toward the covenant renewal that awaited them at Sinai. The memory of the Exodus from Egypt stands as the defining narrative of Israelite identity, the story that transformed them from a community of slaves into a covenant people. It is remembered as both a historical deliverance and a theological drama in which divine power confronted imperial authority, liberating an oppressed group and binding them into a unique relationship with their God. For the Israelites, the Exodus was not just an episode of escape. It was the moment when their collective destiny began to take shape, when the promises made to their ancestors were set into motion, in ways that would echo through every subsequent generation. The tradition recounts that the Israelites had grown numerous in Egypt, arousing the suspicion of a pharaoh who did not remember Joseph. Fearing their numbers and potential alliances with enemies, this ruler imposed forced labour upon them, compelling them to build store cities and endure harsh servitude. The story conveys more than political oppression. It expresses the vulnerability of a minority population under the control of a centralised state. Archaeological and historical evidence confirms that foreign populations in Egypt's delta were frequently subjected to labour conscription. Egyptian inscriptions describe the use of Asiatic labourers for construction projects, particularly in the New Kingdom. Whether or not every detail of the biblical account corresponds precisely to historical events, the memory of enslavement reflects the real tensions between immigrant populations and Egyptian authority. Into this setting emerges the figure of Moses, remembered as the leader chosen to confront Pharaoh and lead his people to freedom. His birth narrative, with a child placed in a basket on the Nile and rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, reflects motifs found in other Near Eastern traditions but adapted to the Israelite experience. Moses grows up in Pharaoh's household yet identifies with his oppressed kin, eventually fleeing into the wilderness after intervening in a conflict. His encounter at the burning bush marks a turning point, where the God of his ancestors reveals the divine name and commissions him to return to Egypt as the instrument of liberation. This story encapsulates the tension between oppression and calling, between exile and mission, that would define Israelite history. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh is remembered as a cosmic struggle between divine power and imperial might. The plagues that follow, the Nile turned to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn, represent not only acts of destruction, but symbolic blows against Egypt's gods and social order. Each plague undermines an aspect of Egyptian life. From the fertility of the Nile to the authority of Pharaoh himself, Scholars have noted natural explanations for some of these events, such as seasonal Nile changes or pest infestations, yet the narrative emphasizes their theological meaning. Israel's God demonstrating supremacy over the greatest empire of the age. The climax comes with the Passover, when Israelite households mark their doorpost with blood to be spared from the final plague. This ritual, remembered and reenacted annually, becomes the central act of memory that ties later generations back to the night of deliverance. The departure from Egypt, often called the Exodus, is described as a mass movement of people accompanied by a dramatic crossing of the sea. The biblical account portrays Pharaoh relenting only to pursue them with chariots, leading to their deliverance through waters that part for the Israelites but overwhelm their pursuers. The event is framed as the decisive act of divine salvation, the moment when bondage ends and freedom begins. While historians debate the scale or historicity of such a crossing, the memory itself holds immense power. Egyptian records do not explicitly mention an Israelite exodus, but references to runaway slaves and Asiatic groups leaving Egypt occur in various sources. The tradition may preserve a collective memory of smaller groups escaping Egyptian control, later magnified into the national story of liberation. For the Israelites, what mattered most was not the precise mechanics, but the conviction that their God had acted on their behalf to break the power of Pharaoh. The journey into the wilderness marks the beginning of a new stage, where the Israelites, no longer slaves, had to learn what it meant to be a people. Their wandering is remembered not only as a geographical movement, but as a period of testing, struggle, and transformation. Hunger, thirst, and discontent arise repeatedly, reflecting the harsh realities of desert life. Yet in these conditions, the Israelites also encounter provision: manna in the morning, quail in the evening, and water from rocks. These stories emphasize dependence upon divine care, teaching that freedom was not simply escape from Egypt, but also trust in the one who had brought them out. The wilderness became the crucible where Israelite identity was forged, stripped of Egypt's security but shaped by new forms of faith and obedience. At the heart of the wilderness experience stands the covenant at Sinai. The narrative recounts that after 3 months, the Israelites reached the mountain where Moses ascended to encounter the divine presence. What follows is remembered as the foundational moment when the Israelites became bound to their God by law and covenant. Unlike treaties of the ancient Near East that imposed obligations from kings upon their vassals, the Sinai covenant established a relationship in which divine authority was grounded in liberation. The preamble declares, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." This statement roots obedience not in fear of conquest, but in gratitude for deliverance. The laws that follow, the 10 Commandments and the broader legal corpus, provided the framework for Israelite life, defining worship, ethics, and community relations. The giving of the law at Sinai reflects parallels with ancient Near Eastern treaty forms. The structure resembles Hittite suzerainty treaties, which begin with historical prologues, stipulations, and blessings or curses. Yet the Israelite version transforms this political form into a theological covenant. The people are not simply subjects of a king, but partners in a relationship with their God. The emphasis on justice, Sabbath rest, and care for the vulnerable reflects both universal ethical concerns and the specific memory of slavery in Egypt. The command to remember the stranger, "For you were strangers in the land of Egypt," demonstrates how collective memory shaped the moral vision of the covenant. The law was not an abstract code, but a living response to the experience of oppression and deliverance. The Sinai narrative also introduces the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary that symbolized divine presence among the people. Its detailed instructions reflect both theological meaning and echoes of Egyptian and Canaanite cultic architecture. The tabernacle served as the focal point of worship, with the Ark of the Covenant housed within as the tangible symbol of divine presence. Priestly roles, sacrificial rituals, and purity laws developed in this context, embedding worship into the daily and seasonal life of the community. The centralization of worship around the tabernacle anticipated later developments in Jerusalem, but in the wilderness it underscored the idea that divine presence travelled with the people, unconfined to a single place. This mobility reflected the Israelites' own unsettled condition, while assuring them of continuity of relationship. The covenant at Sinai also established the principle of collective identity. The people, assembled at the mountain, are described as hearing the divine voice and agreeing to the covenant. This collective assent transforms them from a group of clans into a nation bound by common law and destiny. The imagery of smoke, fire, and thunder emphasizes the awe of the encounter, while the emphasis on obedience underscores the seriousness of the commitment. The later tradition repeatedly returns to this moment as the birth of Israel as a people. Prophets, psalmists, and historians would look back to Sinai as the measure of fidelity and the source of identity, whether in times of faithfulness or in periods of rebellion. Archaeology provides insights into the plausibility of such covenantal traditions. Inscriptions from the Sinai and Negev regions attest to Semitic-speaking groups moving through these deserts during the Late Bronze and Early Iron Ages. Egyptian records of campaigns into Canaan mention groups like the Shasu, nomadic peoples who dwelt in the wilderness. Some scholars have suggested that the early Israelites emerged from such groups, carrying with them memories of liberation and covenant. Whether or not the entire nation assembled at a single mountain, the memory of Sinai functioned as a unifying symbol that bound disparate tribes into a coherent identity. The covenant story provided theological legitimacy for later Israelite institutions, presenting their laws and worship not as human innovations but as divine commands rooted in the foundational event of liberation. The Exodus and Sinai traditions also shaped Israel's later political and theological development. Kings were expected to rule under the authority of the covenant, not as absolute monarchs, but as guardians of divine law. Prophets invoked the Exodus to call the people back to faithfulness, reminding them that the God who delivered them from Egypt demanded justice and obedience. Festivals like Passover reenacted the memory of deliverance, embedding it in the annual rhythm of life. The covenant at Sinai became not merely a past event, but a continual reference point, reminding every generation of who they were and whose they were. The Exodus tradition also resonated beyond Israel's history, influencing later cultures and religious movements. The themes of liberation from oppression, covenantal responsibility, and divine presence among a people found echoes in other contexts where communities sought meaning in suffering and hope in deliverance. Yet for the Israelites, the Exodus remained uniquely theirs, the story that defined their God not as a distant cosmic power, but as the one who intervened in history to rescue and to covenant. This conviction sustained them through wilderness wanderings, conquests, exiles, and restorations, providing a framework for understanding every stage of their history. As the Israelites moved from Sinai, they carried with them the tablets of the law, the Ark of the Covenant, and the memory of thunder and fire on the mountain. These were not only artifacts or recollections, they were living realities that continued to shape their identity. The Exodus had shown them what it meant to be delivered, Sinai had taught them what it meant to belong, and together these experiences laid the foundation for the nation that would emerge in the land of Canaan. The journey ahead would be marked by conflict, settlement, and adaptation, but at its core the Israelites would always define themselves as the people brought out of Egypt and bound at Sinai. The period of the wilderness years stands as one of the most formative stages in the history of the Israelites, a time remembered not for the stability of settled life, but for the constant movement, uncertainty, and testing that took place between the exodus from Egypt and the eventual entrance into Canaan. In the narrative memory, this is not a brief episode, but a prolonged experience lasting 40 years, a symbolic generation in which the people who left Egypt would pass away, while a new generation, hardened and shaped by desert life, would rise to take possession of the land promised to their ancestors. Whether or not the full span of 40 years is literal, the wilderness represents the space where identity was refined, where covenant obligations were tested, and where worship was institutionalized through the tabernacle cult. The Israelites' departure from Sinai began with a sense of divine presence leading them forward. The tradition recounts that a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night went before them, a visible assurance that their God had not abandoned them in the barren landscape. This imagery reflects not only religious symbolism but the real experience of ancient desert travel, where fires and signals guided movements, and where the sky itself could be read for direction. The desert was a place of vulnerability, with scarce water, unpredictable food supplies, and constant threats from hostile tribes. The Israelites, newly freed from Egyptian bondage, quickly discovered that liberty brought its own challenges. Grumbling and complaints punctuate the memory of these years, laments for the food of Egypt, fears of starvation, and anxieties over leadership. These episodes demonstrate that freedom required new habits of trust, ones not easily learned by a people long accustomed to the security of settled land, even under oppression. The provision of manna became one of the central symbols of the wilderness. Each morning, the Israelites found a substance described as fine flakes, which could be gathered and ground into meal. This provision taught dependence. It could not be stored for long, except on the eve of the Sabbath, and so each day the people were reminded that survival depended not on hoarding but on daily trust. Archaeological and natural studies suggest that substances such as resin from tamarisk trees or secretions from insects may have inspired the imagery. But the tradition remembers manna not as a natural occurrence, but as a divine gift, reinforcing the covenant principle that obedience and trust were inseparable from survival. Water too was provided in miraculous ways, whether from springs revealed at Marah and Elim, or from rocks struck by Moses' staff. These narratives reflect the essential struggle of desert life, where water meant life itself, but they are remembered as moments of divine intervention that mark the wilderness as a place of testing and provision. The wilderness years were also marked by conflict with other peoples who inhabited the desert margins. Encounters with the Amalekites, Midianites, and Edomites are preserved in the traditions, reflecting the contested nature of the land through which the Israelites passed. Some of these groups may have been kin-related, others enemies, but each encounter underscored the reality that the Israelites were not moving through empty lands. The desert was crisscrossed with tribal groups, trade routes, and military outposts, and survival required both negotiation and confrontation. These conflicts also served to train the Israelites in collective defense, shaping a people who had once been unarmed slaves into tribes capable of resisting and eventually conquering settled lands. Victory was remembered as dependent not merely on military strategy, but on divine favour, as seen in the story of Moses raising his staff during battle, symbolising the link between worship and warfare. At the centre of the wilderness years stands the institution of the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary constructed according to detailed instructions given at Sinai. The tabernacle served as the focal point of Israelite worship, a movable dwelling for the divine presence. Its design, with an outer court, a holy place, and the innermost holy of holies where the Ark of the Covenant rested, reflected both cosmic symbolism and Near Eastern parallels in temple architecture. Yet unlike the grand stone temples of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the tabernacle was built to travel, made of acacia wood, fabrics, and precious metals that could be dismantled and carried as the people moved. This mobility symbolized a theology of presence. Their God was not confined to a fixed city or monumental structure, but dwelt among them in their wandering. The ark itself, a wooden chest overlaid with gold and surmounted by cherubim, became the most sacred object, representing both divine throne and covenant document, carried before the people in their journeys and battles. The tabernacle cult established patterns of worship and priesthood that would shape Israelite religion for centuries. The Levites were designated as the priestly tribe, with Aaron and his descendants holding the highest priestly office. Detailed regulations governed sacrifices, purity, and ritual, embedding order and holiness into the daily life of the people. Burnt offerings, Grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings created a structured system through which the community maintained its relationship with the divine. Each ritual served not only a spiritual function, but also reinforced communal cohesion, reminding the Israelites that they were bound together by shared practices distinct from the nations around them. The laws of purity, touching everything from diet to bodily conditions, further reinforced identity by setting boundaries that maintained separateness even as they moved among other peoples. The wilderness narratives also emphasize episodes of rebellion and judgment, reflecting the tension between freedom and responsibility. The golden calf incident, where the people fashioned an idol while Moses was on the mountain, demonstrated the temptation to revert to visible symbols of divinity familiar from Egyptian religion. The punishment that followed reinforced the seriousness of covenant obligations. Other episodes, such as the complaints against manna or the challenges to Moses' leadership by Korah and others, highlight the fragility of authority and the constant testing of faith. These rebellions serve as warnings in the tradition, but also as reflections of real tensions in a community struggling to adapt to new forms of identity. The wilderness was not simply a place of provision, but also a proving ground, where failure was common, but where identity was ultimately forged through perseverance. The symbolism of the number 40, repeated throughout the wilderness traditions, conveys more than chronological time. In ancient Near Eastern numerology, 40 often signified a full generation or a period of testing. The 40 years in the desert represented the transformation of a people. Those who had known Egypt would not enter the land, while their children, hardened by wilderness life, would inherit the promise. This generational shift underscores the idea that liberation was not instantaneous, but required reformation of character and community. The desert, barren and inhospitable, became the teacher that stripped away dependence on Egypt and replaced it with dependence on covenant. In later memory, the wilderness would symbolize both hardship and intimacy, a place where the people failed, yet also experienced their God's presence most directly. Archaeological studies of settlement patterns in the Sinai and Negev reveal evidence of temporary encampments, pottery fragments, and inscriptions that attest to nomadic groups moving through these regions during the Late Bronze and Early Iron Ages. While it remains debated whether these traces can be directly linked to the Israelites, they confirm that the wilderness was indeed inhabited and traversed during this period. Egyptian records mention military outposts in the Sinai to guard trade routes and mining operations, further suggesting that the Israelites' journey intersected with the political realities of the age. The wilderness narratives may combine memories of different groups and times, woven into a unified tradition that emphasized divine guidance and covenantal identity above precise historical details. The tabernacle cult also provided a model for later temple worship in Jerusalem. The division into sacred zones, the roles of priests and Levites, and the cycle of offerings all found continuity in the temple system that developed centuries later. The wilderness experience ensured that Israelite worship was not bound to a particular geography, but could exist in mobile form, a principle that would prove essential during later exiles, when the people once again found themselves without a central sanctuary. The memory of the tabernacle reinforced the conviction that divine presence was not confined to one place, but accompanied the people wherever they went, so long as they remained faithful to the covenant. The wilderness years culminated in the approach to the land of Canaan, but before entry the Israelites had to endure the loss of their great leader. Moses, who had led them out of Egypt, mediated the covenant, and guided them through decades of wandering, was not permitted to enter the promised land himself. His death on Mount Nebo, overlooking Canaan, marked the transition to a new generation under new leadership. The wilderness thus ended as it began, with both promise and incompleteness. The people were on the threshold of fulfillment, but still shaped by the memory of hardship, provision, rebellion, and worship that had defined their journey. The wilderness remained in their collective memory as the crucible in which they became a people, not merely freed slaves, but a covenant nation with law, priesthood, and identity. As they prepared to cross into Canaan, the Israelites carried with them the Ark of the Covenant, the rituals of the tabernacle, and the lessons of 40 years of struggle. These elements bound them together and gave them confidence that their God was with them. The wilderness was not simply a backdrop to their story, but an essential stage in their transformation. It ensured that when they entered the land, they did so not as scattered tribes, but as a people united by covenant, shaped by discipline, and sustained by worship. The land ahead promised settlement and stability, but the memory of the wilderness would always remind them of their dependence and their calling. The entrance into Canaan marks one of the most decisive and debated moments in the history of the Israelites, a stage remembered in tradition as both a divinely commanded conquest and a gradual process of settlement. The biblical narrative frames this as the fulfillment of promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, now realized by their descendants after generations of waiting and wandering. The land that had been shown to the patriarchs, temporarily exchanged for Egypt's abundance, and long anticipated through the hardships of the desert, now lay before them. The stories of crossing the Jordan, capturing fortified cities, and dividing territory among tribes present the image of a people newly formed by covenant taking possession of their inheritance. Yet archaeology and comparative studies paint a complex picture, suggesting that the emergence of Israel in Canaan involved not only conquest, but also gradual infiltration, adaptation, and internal transformation. Together, tradition and archaeology reveal the layered reality of how a tribal confederation took root in the highlands of the Levant. The account of entry begins with the dramatic crossing of the Jordan River. Just as the Israelites had crossed the sea when leaving Egypt, now they entered their land through another miraculous crossing. The Ark of the Covenant, carried by priests, is remembered as the instrument of divine presence that caused the waters to stand still while the people passed on dry ground. Stones were taken from the riverbed and set up as memorials, underscoring the sacred nature of the event. This narrative provided theological symmetry. The same God who delivered them from Egypt now brought them into Canaan, sealing their identity as a people sustained by divine intervention at every crucial juncture. Historically, the Jordan Valley was a natural entry point for groups moving into the highlands, and seasonal variations in the river may have been woven into the tradition, but the memory preserved is one of continuity between exodus and settlement. The conquest traditions focus heavily on the figure of Joshua, the successor of Moses, who is remembered as a military leader and covenant enforcer. Under his leadership, cities such as Jericho and Ai are described as falling through divine intervention, rather than conventional siege tactics. Jericho's walls collapse after ritual marches and trumpet blasts, symbolizing victory through obedience rather than military strength. Ai is captured after an initial defeat is reversed through renewed strategy and divine guidance. These stories highlight the theological message that conquest was not the achievement of human power, but the fulfillment of divine promise. Archaeology, however, complicates this picture. Excavations at Jericho show that the city was not strongly fortified, at the time traditionally associated with Joshua's conquest. While Ai appears to have been abandoned, other sites show destruction layers, but often centuries apart. These discrepancies suggest that the biblical account condenses and theologizes a process that was more gradual and less uniform than the dramatic narratives suggest. Beyond specific battles, the broader pattern of settlement reveals that Israelite identity emerged primarily in the central highlands of Canaan. Archaeological surveys have uncovered hundreds of small villages appearing suddenly in the Iron Age Amman period, around the 12th to 11th centuries BCE. These sites are characterized by simple four-room houses, absence of pig bones and dietary remains, and storage facilities for grain. The lack of monumental architecture suggests egalitarian communities rather than centralized states. Many scholars interpret this as evidence of new population groups, possibly displaced or marginalized peoples from Canaanite cities, coalescing into a distinct culture. The biblical traditions of conquest may preserve the memory of conflicts with certain city-states, while the archaeological evidence points to widespread rural settlement by groups who gradually developed a new identity as Israelites. The tension between conquest and settlement is also reflected in the biblical text itself. While the book of Joshua presents a unified and sweeping conquest, the book of Judges depicts a more piecemeal process, with tribes struggling to control territories and often coexisting with Canaanite populations. Some cities remained unconquered, and Israelite tribes frequently lapsed into alliances or conflicts with their neighbours. This duality suggests that the conquest tradition was shaped by both collective memory and later theological reflection, while the reality was a protracted and uneven process. The Israelites did not replace Canaanite culture overnight, but absorbed, adapted, and transformed aspects of it, while maintaining distinct markers of identity through covenant, worship, and law. Religious transformation played a critical role in the settlement process. The Israelites brought with them the covenantal traditions of Sinai and the tabernacle cult, but in Canaan they encountered well-established religious practices centered on fertility deities such as Baal and Asherah. The biblical tradition repeatedly warns against assimilation, presenting Israelite history as a struggle between fidelity to their God and the allure of Canaanite religion. Archaeological discoveries of household shrines, pillar figurines, and inscriptions suggest that many Israelites did adopt or adapt Canaanite practices, at least at the household level. Yet the central narrative of conquest and covenant insists that the true identity of Israel lay in rejecting these influences and maintaining exclusive loyalty to their God. This tension between syncretism and distinctiveness would continue to shape Israelite religion for centuries. The division of land among tribes formed another key aspect of settlement. The biblical memory describes detailed allotments, with each tribe receiving specific territories marked by boundaries and cities. These divisions reflect both historical geography and later attempts to explain tribal organization. Archaeological evidence suggests that tribal identity was flexible, with shifting alliances and confederations rather than rigid boundaries. Yet the memory of 12 tribes, each descended from a son of Jacob, provided a unifying framework that reinforced common ancestry and covenantal unity. The tribal system functioned as a means of organizing both land and society, distributing responsibility, and ensuring cohesion in the absence of a centralized monarchy. Conflicts with indigenous populations are remembered vividly in the conquest traditions. The destruction of cities such as Hazor is highlighted, and archaeological evidence indeed shows Hazor experienced major destruction around the 13th century BCE. Whether this was the result of Israelite conquest or broader regional upheavals remains debated, but the alignment between tradition and material evidence suggests that some memories of conquest preserve genuine historical events. Other cities, however, show no signs of destruction, indicating peaceful assimilation or cohabitation. The reality was likely a combination. Some Canaanite strongholds fell, others were bypassed, and many populations were absorbed into the emerging Israelite identity. The biblical narrative interprets this process through the lens of divine command and fulfillment of promise, but the historical process was shaped by both conflict and coexistence. The conquest and settlement period also reflects the larger context of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, many great powers of the Near East experienced decline, including the Hittite Empire and the weakening of Egyptian control in Canaan. City-states were destroyed or abandoned, trade networks disrupted, and new groups such as the Sea Peoples appeared on the Mediterranean coast. In this environment of instability, the Israelites emerged as one of several new peoples who took root in the highlands. The biblical memory of conquest can thus be understood as part of a larger regional transformation, where shifting populations, collapsing states, and social upheaval created opportunities for new identities to form. The Israelites' distinctiveness lay in how they interpreted this process, not as mere survival or opportunism, but as the outworking of divine promise and covenant. Cultural markers of early Israelite settlement provide further insight into their identity. The absence of pig bones in dietary remains has been widely noted as a distinguishing feature, suggesting dietary practices rooted in covenantal law. The preference for small, unwalled villages reflects a rejection of the hierarchical city-state model, aligning with the biblical emphasis on egalitarian tribal structures. The presence of collared-rim jars, a distinctive pottery type, has become a key archaeological indicator of early Israelite sites. Together, these features illustrate how identity was expressed not only through stories and laws, but also through everyday practices of food, housing, and community life. The Israelites distinguished themselves from their neighbours through both ideology and material culture. The settlement process culminated in the establishment of sanctuaries where the covenant could be renewed. Sites such as Shechem, Shiloh, and Bethel are remembered as centres of worship, housing the ark or hosting assemblies of tribes. At Shechem, the people are described as gathering to reaffirm the covenant, inscribing laws on stones and declaring loyalty to their God. These assemblies functioned as both religious and political events, uniting tribes that otherwise lived scattered across the highlands. The sanctuaries served as visible symbols of divine presence, anchoring identity in specific places even as the people spread across the land. These early cultic centres anticipated the later centralisation of worship in Jerusalem, but reflected the decentralised and tribal nature of the early settlement period. The conquest and settlement of Canaan therefore cannot be reduced to a single event or model. Tradition remembers it as a swift and divinely mandated conquest under Joshua. Archaeology reveals it as a gradual and complex process of settlement, and historical analysis situates it within the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilizations. Yet all these perspectives converge on the reality that the Israelites emerged in this period as a distinct people rooted in the highlands of Canaan. Their identity was shaped by covenant traditions from the wilderness, struggles with Canaanite culture, and the forging of new social structures. The land that had been promised to the patriarchs was now inhabited, not without struggle or compromise, but with a sense of destiny that bound the people together. From this foundation, the next stage of their history would unfold as they navigated the challenges of maintaining unity, defending their land, and developing new forms of leadership in the period that followed. The period remembered as the time of the Judges occupies a liminal space in the history of the Israelites, a time after the initial settlement in Canaan but before the establishment of monarchy. In later memory, it was described as an age of instability, when every man did what was right in his own eyes, and yet it was also the period when the tribes learned to function as a confederation, bound not by centralized authority, but by shared covenant, law, and occasional leaders raised up in moments of crisis. The stories preserved from this era are filled with cycles of struggle, foreign oppression, cries for deliverance, the rise of a judge, temporary peace, and then relapse into disorder. Archaeology and comparative studies suggest that this was a formative stage, when small highland villages coexisted uneasily with powerful Canaanite city-states, when tribal alliances shifted constantly, and when Israelite identity remained fragile, tested both by external enemies and internal disunity. The political structure of this time was decentralized. There was no king, no permanent capital, and no standing army. Instead, the tribes functioned as loosely connected kin groups, bound together primarily by ancestry and covenantal traditions. At certain sanctuaries, such as Shiloh or Shechem, assemblies of tribes could be convened, often for religious or judicial purposes, but day-to-day life was organised at the clan and village level. This system provided flexibility and allowed the Israelites to adapt to their highland environment, but it also made them vulnerable to better organised enemies. The judges themselves were not monarchs, but charismatic leaders, warriors, prophets, or local chieftains, who arose when needed to rally the tribes. Their authority was temporary and usually limited to specific regions. but their stories reflect how leadership operated in a society without central institutions. One of the earliest episodes from this period involves the figure of Deborah, a prophetess and judge who led the Israelites against Canaanite oppression under King Jabin of Hazor and his general Sisera. The Song of Deborah, preserved in poetic form, is one of the oldest pieces of Israelite literature, describing how various tribes responded to the call to arms while others stayed aloof. The victory is attributed not to military might, but to divine intervention, with Sisera's chariots bogged down by sudden rains. This story reflects both the realities of Canaanite military superiority, especially with iron chariots, and the ability of tribal coalitions to resist through guerrilla tactics and strategic alliances. It also highlights the fragility of unity, as not all tribes participated, foreshadowing the recurring problem of disunity throughout the period. Other judges embody different aspects of leadership and crisis. Gideon is remembered as a reluctant leader, called to resist Midianite raiders who plundered Israelite harvests. His story emphasizes divine selection of the weak to accomplish deliverance, with his army deliberately reduced to a small number to demonstrate that victory came from divine power rather than human strength. Yet Gideon also illustrates the dangers of leadership in a tribal system. After his victories, he created an ephod that became an object of worship, blurring the lines between legitimate and illegitimate cult. His son Abimelech went further, declaring himself king in Shechem and ruling violently until his downfall. These episodes reveal both the attraction of centralized authority and the dangers it posed, as well as the ongoing tension between covenantal ideals and human ambition. Samson represents another type of judge, a figure whose personal strength and exploits against the Philistines dominate the narrative. Unlike earlier enemies, the Philistines were not nomadic raiders, but a settled and technologically advanced people on the coastal plain, with superior weapons and organized political structures. Samson's battles reflect the ongoing contest between highland Israelites and lowland Philistines, a struggle that would continue for generations. His story also reflects the dangers of individualism and personal weakness, as his strength is undermined by betrayal and lack of discipline. Samson's life ends in a dramatic act of destruction, collapsing a Philistine temple, but his story symbolizes the incomplete and often chaotic nature of deliverance during the period of the judges. Victories were real, but often temporary, and leaders were as flawed as the people they served. The cyclical pattern of oppression and deliverance became the defining motif of the period. According to the tradition, the Israelites repeatedly turned to the practices of surrounding peoples, abandoning exclusive worship of their God. As a result, foreign oppressors gained power over them: Moabites, Ammonites, Midianites, and Philistines. In their distress, the people cried out, and a judge was raised up to lead them. Peace followed for a generation, only for the cycle to repeat. This pattern reflected not only theological interpretation, but also the real instability of tribal societies surrounded by stronger neighbours. Without a standing army or centralised government, the Israelites were vulnerable to raids and domination. Yet their resilience lay in their ability to unite temporarily and to draw strength from their covenantal faith. Archaeology sheds light on the social realities of this period. The highland villages of Iron Age Sween were small, usually housing a few extended families. Agricultural terraces and cisterns reveal adaptation to the rugged terrain, while pottery styles indicate continuity with Canaanite culture but with distinctive features. The absence of monumental structures reflects the egalitarian ethos of tribal society. At the same time, evidence of destruction layers in certain Canaanite cities suggest conflicts between highland groups and urban centres, aligning with the traditions of clashes recorded in Judges. Inscriptions from surrounding peoples, such as the Moabite stone, confirm that Israel was known to its neighbours as a distinct entity by the 9th century BCE, indicating that the identity forged in this earlier period had lasting impact. The religious dimension of the Judges period is equally significant. The tabernacle at Shiloh served as a central sanctuary, housing the Ark of the Covenant and functioning as a focus of worship. Yet local shrines and altars also proliferated, reflecting the decentralized nature of religion in a tribal society. The biblical narratives condemn the Israelites for adopting Canaanite practices, particularly the worship of Baal and Asherah, fertility deities associated with agricultural cycles. Archaeological finds of household figurines support the idea that syncretism was common. The tension between centralized covenantal worship and local practices created constant friction, setting the stage for later reforms under monarchy and prophetic movements. The period of the Judges thus represents not only political instability, but also religious fluidity, as the Israelites struggled to define their identity in the midst of surrounding cultures. The social dynamics of the period also reveal underlying fractures. Stories such as the civil war against the tribe of Benjamin, triggered by the crime at Gibeah, demonstrate how tribal solidarity could collapse into devastating conflict. The violence of these episodes underscores the fragility of unity in the absence of central authority. At the same time, the stories emphasize the role of covenant renewal in restoring order. Gatherings at Shechem or Mizpah served as moments when the tribes reaffirmed their bond, even after civil strife. These episodes show that while disunity was a constant danger, the covenant remained the glue that held the tribes together, even if imperfectly. The memory of the Judges period shaped Israelite identity in profound ways. It was remembered as a time of chaos, of foreign oppression and internal conflict, but also as a time when deliverance came through unexpected leaders, and when the people learned to rely on their God in the absence of human kings. Later generations looked back on this era, both with nostalgia for its simplicity and with recognition of its dangers. The refrain that there was no king in Israel prepared the way for the eventual acceptance of monarchy, but it also reminded later Israelites that their true king was their God, and that human rulers could never replace covenantal responsibility. Historically, the period of the Judges reflects the challenges of state formation in the ancient Near East. Emerging peoples often passed through stages of tribal confederation before developing centralized monarchies. For the Israelites, this process was shaped by their unique covenantal traditions, which both restrained and inspired leadership. The Judges provided temporary solutions to immediate crises but could not establish lasting stability. Yet without this period, the Israelites might never have developed the resilience, shared identity, and covenantal framework that enabled them to transition into monarchy when the time came. The Judges period was thus a crucible of both crisis and creativity, forging the foundations upon which later Israelite society would be built. As the stories of Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson fade into the background, the people stand at the threshold of a new stage. Pressure from the Philistines intensifies, disunity among the tribes persists, and the limitations of charismatic leadership become ever clearer. Out of this environment arises the call for a king, a central authority who could unify the tribes, defend against enemies, and provide stability. The memory of the Judges period thus flows naturally into the rise of monarchy, carrying forward both the lessons of crisis and the longing for order that would define the next phase of Israelite history. The transition from tribal confederation to monarchy stands as one of the most transformative periods in the history of the Israelites. For generations they had lived as loosely organized tribes, united by ancestry, covenant, and shared memory of liberation, but fractured by local interests and often paralyzed by disunity in the face of external threats. The charismatic leaders of the Judges had provided deliverance in moments of crisis, but never established lasting order. As the Philistine threat grew more severe in the 11th century BCE, the limitations of this system became impossible to ignore. The call for a king was born out of desperation for unity, stability, and military strength. Yet this shift was deeply controversial, for it challenged the covenantal principle that Israel's true king was their God. The rise of monarchy, beginning with the figure of Saul, thus unfolded as both a political necessity and a theological dilemma, a moment of promise shadowed by unease that would shape Israel's future for centuries. The Philistines had established themselves firmly along the coastal plain, part of the wider Sea Peoples' migrations that reshaped the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. With their iron weaponry, fortified cities and organised political structures, they posed a formidable challenge to the decentralised Israelite tribes in the highlands. Repeated defeats at their hands underscored the inadequacy of tribal militias. The ark itself was captured in battle, a devastating symbol of Israel's weakness and disunity. In this context, the elders of Israel approached the prophet Samuel, demanding a king to judge them and to go out before them in battle, like the nations around them. Their request reflected both pragmatic concerns and a departure from earlier ideals. Samuel warned that kings would impose taxes, conscription, and forced labour, turning free tribesmen into subjects. Yet the demand persisted, and so the first king was chosen. Saul, the son of Kish from the tribe of Benjamin, is remembered as Israel's inaugural monarch. His selection was marked by ambiguity, both divine election and human demand. The narrative describes him as tall and impressive in stature, qualities befitting a leader who could inspire confidence in battle. His rise began with a successful campaign against the Ammonites, which rallied the tribes to his side and confirmed his kingship. In these early victories, Saul embodied the hope that centralized leadership could deliver security and unity. The people, once scattered and fearful, now had a figure to rally behind. For the first time, Israel began to resemble the surrounding nations, with a king leading armies and asserting authority beyond tribal boundaries. Yet the transition was fraught with tension. Saul's reign reveals the difficulties of establishing monarchy in a society rooted in covenantal traditions and tribal independence. His authority was constantly tested by internal divisions and by the expectations of prophetic oversight. Samuel, who had anointed Saul, remained a powerful figure, reminding both king and people that monarchy did not replace covenantal obligations. When Saul overstepped boundaries, failing to wait for Samuel before offering sacrifice, sparing enemies against divine command, he was condemned as having rejected divine authority. These episodes highlight the uneasy balance between royal power and prophetic accountability. Unlike the kings of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Israel's monarchs were never absolute. Their legitimacy depended on fidelity to covenant and obedience to prophetic voices. The conflicts with the Philistines dominated Saul's reign. The Philistines maintained control of iron technology, restricting Israel's ability to produce weapons, and established garrisons that suppressed resistance. Saul's forces were often small and poorly equipped, yet his son Jonathan demonstrated remarkable courage, striking at Philistine outposts and inspiring Israelite confidence. These skirmishes reflect the desperate struggle of a people caught between their aspiration for independence and the reality of superior enemies. Archaeological evidence from this period confirms the Philistines' dominance, with their distinctive pottery, architecture, and fortifications visible in sites like Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Israel's emergence as a kingdom cannot be separated from this conflict. The monarchy itself was born as a response to Philistine pressure. The decline of Saul's reign is remembered as tragic. His initial victories gave way to instability, jealousy, and estrangement from both prophet and people. The emergence of David, the young shepherd who defeated Goliath, further undermined Saul's position. David's popularity, especially among the people in the military, contrasted with Saul's increasing paranoia. The narrative portrays Saul as tormented, estranged from divine favour, and consumed by jealousy toward David. His desperate consultation of a medium before his final battle underscores the sense of alienation from divine guidance. The monarchy that had begun with such promise ended with Saul's death in battle against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa, a sobering reminder of both the necessity and the fragility of kingship. The memory of Saul's reign carried deep ambivalence. On one hand, he was the first king, the one who had united the tribes and begun the process of state formation. On the other, his failures underscored the dangers of a monarchy when disconnected from covenantal faithfulness. His reign embodied the tension that would characterize Israelite kingship throughout history: the need for centralized authority to secure survival and prosperity, balanced against the prophetic insistence that kings remain servants of covenant rather than absolute rulers. Saul's story thus became both a warning and a prelude, setting the stage for the rise of David, whose reign would bring Israel to its height, but also deepen the complexities of monarchy. The transition to kingship also reshaped Israelite society. The demands of a monarchy required new forms of taxation, administration, and military organization. The tribes, once fiercely independent, were now drawn into a national structure. This transformation created opportunities for greater unity and strength, but also sowed the seeds of future discontent. The prophetic critiques of kingship preserved in the traditions reflect the people's unease with the loss of freedom and the burdens imposed by royal demands. Yet the same traditions also recognize that without a king, Israel could not have withstood its enemies. The monarchy was thus both gift and burden, solution and problem, reflecting the complexity of Israel's historical reality. From an archaeological perspective, the rise of monarchy corresponds with changes in settlement patterns. Larger fortified sites appear in the highlands, signalling greater centralization. Pottery distributions indicate increased trade and communication between regions, while inscriptions and administrative artifacts suggest the beginnings of bureaucratic control. These developments align with the biblical memory of monarchy as a transformative stage, turning scattered tribes into a more cohesive political entity. Yet the evidence also shows continuity with earlier tribal life, underscoring that the transition was gradual and contested rather than absolute. The story of Saul and the rise of monarchy thus represents a pivotal moment in Israelite history. It was the time when necessity forced change, when the realities of external threat and internal disunity pushed the tribes to accept centralized authority. It was also the time when the theological question of kingship emerged. How could a people who proclaim their God as king also accept a human monarch? The answer remained unresolved, as Saul's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of kingship. His death opened the way for David, whose reign would bring new heights of unity and expansion, but whose legacy would also deepen the contradictions of monarchy. The Israelites had crossed a threshold. They were no longer merely a confederation of tribes, but a kingdom among kingdoms, bound now to navigate the challenges of power, responsibility, and faithfulness in a world where kingship was both inevitable and dangerous. The rise of David marks the beginning of the most celebrated and enduring memory in the history of the Israelites, a period remembered as the golden age of unity, expansion, and covenantal promise. If Saul represented the troubled birth of monarchy, David embodied its flourishing, the shepherd who became king, the warrior who subdued enemies, the poet whose songs gave voice to Israel's worship, and the ruler who established Jerusalem as the political and spiritual center of the nation. His reign is remembered with both admiration and complexity, for it combined extraordinary achievements with personal failings, creating a legacy that shaped Israel's identity for centuries. The establishment of Jerusalem as the capital and the Ark's relocation there provided the foundation for a national identity centered on both monarchy and worship, anchoring the people in a city that would remain at the heart of their history. David's rise to power began under the shadow of Saul's decline. Initially known as a skilled musician and brave warrior, he gained fame through his defeat of Goliath, a Philistine champion whose size and weaponry had terrified Israel's army. The story of David and Goliath became emblematic of Israel's belief that victory came not from strength of arms, but from trust in divine power. Yet David's growing popularity stirred Saul's jealousy, leading to years of tension, pursuit, and exile. David gathered a band of followers, often marginalized figures and discontented men, and lived as an outlaw in the wilderness. His refusal to harm Saul despite opportunities reinforced his legitimacy as a leader, chosen not by ambition but by divine will. These years of struggle shaped David into a figure who understood both the fragility of power and the necessity of restraint, qualities that prepared him for kingship. Saul's death in battle against the Philistines created a power vacuum. David was anointed king first over Judah, his own tribe, while Saul's son Ishbosheth ruled the northern tribes. Years of civil conflict followed, until Ishbosheth's death paved the way for David's recognition as king over all Israel. This unification of tribes under a single ruler was a remarkable achievement, transforming a fragmented confederation into a kingdom. David's leadership combined military prowess, political skill and religious devotion, enabling him to consolidate power and expand Israel's influence in the region. The once divided tribes now rallied behind a king who embodied their aspirations for security, prosperity, and covenantal destiny. David's military campaigns expanded Israel's territory and secured its borders. The Philistines, long the dominant power on the coastal plain, were decisively subdued, ensuring Israel's independence and safety. Victories over Moab, Edom, Ammon, and Aram extended Israel's influence, creating a small empire that controlled trade routes and demanded tribute from neighbouring peoples. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Tel Dan and the Mesha Stele, though from later centuries, reflects the memory of a strong Davidic dynasty, recognised by surrounding nations. These successes gave Israel a stature it had never before possessed, transforming it from a vulnerable collection of tribes into a recognised kingdom. Yet these expansions also introduced the complexities of empire, managing subject peoples, maintaining armies, and balancing power with covenantal ideals. The most significant decision of David's reign was the choice of Jerusalem as his capital. Located on the border between the tribal territories of Judah and Benjamin, Jerusalem was strategically neutral, not belonging exclusively to any one tribe. By capturing it from the Jebusites and making it his political centre, David created a unifying capital that transcended tribal divisions. Jerusalem's location also offered natural defences, situated on high ground with valleys on three sides. From this stronghold, David could administer his growing kingdom and symbolise unity among the tribes. The establishment of Jerusalem as capital was not merely a political act, but a defining moment in Israelite identity, for the city would become synonymous with kingship, covenant, and divine presence. David further elevated Jerusalem by bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the city. This act signified more than religious devotion. It represented the merging of political and spiritual authority. The Ark, the symbol of covenant and divine presence, was now housed in the city of the king, binding monarchy and worship together in a way that would shape Israel's destiny. The celebration of the Ark's arrival, with music, dancing, and sacrifice, underscored the centrality of worship in national life. David's plan to build a permanent temple was initially resisted, but the promise given to him through the prophet Nathan established the theological foundation of the Davidic covenant, that his dynasty would endure and that his son would build the house for the Ark. This promise elevated David's reign beyond political achievement, embedding it in a vision of divine destiny that would resonate for generations. The image of David as both warrior and poet added depth to his legacy. He was remembered not only for his victories but also for his psalms, which gave voice to praise, lament, and trust. These songs reflected the full range of human experience, from triumph to despair, and became central to Israel's worship. The association of David with the Psalms reinforced his role as a man after God's heart, embodying both devotion and authenticity. His legacy thus combined martial strength with spiritual depth, creating a model of kingship that united power and piety. Even when later kings failed, the memory of David provided a standard of what a ruler should be. Yet David's reign was not without failure and tragedy. His sin with Bathsheba, followed by the arranged death of her husband Uriah, revealed the dangers of unchecked royal power. The prophet Nathan's confrontation demonstrated that even the king was subject to covenantal accountability. reinforcing the principle that monarchy did not replace divine authority. The consequences of David's sin unfolded in family turmoil, the rebellion of his son Absalom, the violation of his daughter Tamar, and the rivalry among his heirs. These episodes revealed the fragility of the royal house and foreshadowed future instability in the dynasty. David's later years were marked by both triumph and sorrow, victories over enemies but also personal grief and the painful recognition of his own failures. Archaeology and historical analysis provide glimpses into the reality of David's reign. The Tel Dan inscription, dating to the 9th century BCE, refers to the House of David, confirming that his dynasty was remembered and recognized by neighboring peoples within a century of his life. Excavations in Jerusalem and the surrounding highlands reveal evidence of urban expansion and fortifications that align with the growth of a centralized state. While debates continue over the precise scale of David's kingdom, the convergence of biblical tradition and material evidence points to a significant transformation in this period, with Jerusalem emerging as a political and religious centre of enduring importance. The legacy of David's reign is best understood in the promises associated with his dynasty. The covenant with David, promising that his throne would endure, became a cornerstone of Israelite hope. Even after the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile, prophets and poets looked back to David as the model king and anticipated a future ruler from his line who would restore justice and peace. This messianic hope, born out of the Davidic covenant, ensured that his reign was not simply a past glory, but a continuing source of expectation. The establishment of Jerusalem as the city of David reinforced this hope, for the city itself became the symbol of divine presence and the focus of Israel's longing in times of loss. David's reign thus represents the height of Israelite unity and the beginning of its enduring symbols. He unified the tribes, defeated enemies, expanded territory, established Jerusalem as capital, and brought the ark into the city, merging monarchy and covenant. Yet he also embodied the contradictions of kingship, the capacity for greatness and the temptation of power, the call to piety and the reality of sin. His story is remembered not in sanitized perfection but in human complexity, a king whose failures were as instructive as his triumphs. In this complexity lies the enduring power of his legacy, for Israel remembered him not as flawless but as chosen, not as invincible but as faithful despite failure. His reign laid the foundations for his son Solomon, whose rule would bring even greater splendour, but also set in motion the tensions that would eventually fracture the kingdom. The reign of Solomon stands as the pinnacle of Israel's monarchy in the collective memory, a period remembered for peace, prosperity, and the splendour of the temple that became the centre of Israelite worship for centuries. If David had been the warrior king who secured the land and established Jerusalem as the capital, Solomon was the builder and administrator who consolidated those achievements and transformed them into enduring institutions. His reign is remembered as a time when Israel reached the height of its influence, when wisdom and wealth flourished, and when Jerusalem became not only a political capital, but a spiritual beacon. Yet beneath this golden image lay tensions that would eventually fracture the kingdom, for the very achievements of Solomon carried within them seeds of division, burden, and compromise. Solomon's rise to the throne was marked by struggle and intrigue. As David's health declined, rival factions emerged around his sons. Adonijah, supported by key military and priestly figures, sought to claim the throne, but the prophet Nathan and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, secured David's oath that Solomon would be king. In a dramatic moment, Solomon was anointed while David still lived, forestalling Adonijah's ambitions. This succession crisis revealed both the fragility of dynastic politics and the importance of prophetic and priestly support in legitimizing kingship. Once enthroned, Solomon consolidated his power ruthlessly, eliminating rivals and establishing firm control. The transition underscored that monarchy, even under the covenantal framework, was subject to the same political realities as other kingdoms of the ancient Near East. The memory of Solomon is dominated by his wisdom. Stories describe his ability to discern truth, as in the famous judgment between two women claiming the same child. His reputation spread beyond Israel, attracting foreign rulers such as the Queen of Sheba, who came to test him with hard questions and left impressed by his wealth and wisdom. These traditions emphasize that Solomon's greatness was not only military or political, but intellectual and spiritual. Wisdom literature associated with him, such as Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, reflects a culture that valued reflection on life, morality, and divine order. Whether Solomon himself authored these works or whether they were later attributed to him, the association underscores the image of his reign as an age of wisdom and learning, contrasting with the turbulence of earlier times. Solomon's reign was also marked by unprecedented prosperity. Control of trade routes brought wealth through commerce, tribute, and alliances. The kingdom's territory, secured by David, allowed Solomon to focus on administration rather than warfare. Archaeological evidence from the 10th century BCE, though debated in scale, suggests increased urbanization, fortifications, and monumental architecture. Sites such as Megiddo, Hazor, and Giza show evidence of large gate complexes and construction projects attributed to Solomon's reign, reflecting the growth of centralized authority and state-sponsored building. The memory of Solomon's wealth, described in gold, exotic imports, and grand feasts, reinforced the image of a kingdom at its height, admired by surrounding nations. The most enduring achievement of Solomon was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. David had long desired to build a permanent house for the ark, but the task fell to his son. Solomon's temple was built on Mount Moriah, on the site where David had purchased land and offered sacrifice. The construction took 7 years and involved massive resources, including timber from Lebanon supplied by Hiram of Tyre, skilled artisans, and thousands of conscripted labourers. The temple's design reflected Near Eastern architectural traditions, with a rectangular layout divided into the outer court, the holy place, and the innermost Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant rested. Its walls were lined with cedar, overlaid with gold, and adorned with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. Bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz stood at the entrance, while the great bronze sea rested on 12 bulls in the courtyard. The temple was both modest compared to Egyptian or Mesopotamian temples, and yet grand enough to symbolize Israel's entry into the circle of great nations. The dedication of the temple marked a climactic moment in Israel's history. The ark was brought into the Holy of Holies, and the narrative recounts that a cloud filled the temple, symbolizing divine presence. Solomon's prayer emphasized that the temple could not contain the infinite God, but would serve as a place where prayers would be heard, whether from Israelites or foreigners who came to seek the God of Israel. This inclusiveness reflected a vision of Jerusalem not only as Israel's center, but as a place where the nations could encounter the divine. The temple thus became the focal point of worship, pilgrimage, and national identity, anchoring the covenant in a permanent structure. For centuries, even after its destruction, the memory of Solomon's temple would define Israelite religion and serve as the model for hope and restoration. Solomon's reign also involved extensive administrative reforms. The kingdom was divided into districts for taxation and supply, creating structures that centralized authority and reduced tribal autonomy. These measures strengthened the monarchy, but also placed heavy burdens on the population. Large-scale building projects required conscription of labour, echoing the practices of surrounding empires. The biblical tradition remembers these burdens as a source of later discontent, for the prosperity of Solomon's reign came at the cost of social strain. The prophetic critique of kingship, first voiced in the time of Samuel, found confirmation in these realities, as the people experienced both the splendour and the weight of monarchy. Foreign alliances were another hallmark of Solomon's reign. His marriage to Pharaoh's daughter symbolized Israel's elevated status, for such unions were reserved for equals among great powers. Other marriages to foreign princesses created political ties, but also introduced religious tensions. The biblical narrative criticizes Solomon for allowing his foreign wives to establish shrines for their gods, leading to syncretism within the kingdom. These traditions reflect the enduring concern with covenantal fidelity and the danger of compromise. The blending of political alliances and religious practices foreshadowed future conflicts, as Israel struggled to balance engagement with the nations and loyalty to their God. The later years of Solomon's reign are remembered less favourably. Heavy taxation, forced labour, and the presence of foreign cults eroded unity. Adversaries arose at the borders, including Hadad of Edom and Rezon of Damascus, challenging Israel's dominance. Internal opposition grew, particularly among the northern tribes, who resented the burdens imposed by the central government. These tensions would soon erupt into open division after Solomon's death. Thus, the reign remembered as Israel's golden age also carried within it the seeds of fragmentation, for the very achievements of Solomon created pressures that his successors could not contain. From an archaeological and historical perspective, the extent of Solomon's kingdom remains debated. Some scholars argue that the grandeur described in the biblical account reflects later idealization, while others point to material evidence of significant state formation in the 10th century BCE. Regardless of scale, the memory of Solomon's reign became central to Israel's identity. The temple he built, the wisdom he embodied, and the wealth he amassed became symbols of what Israel could achieve under divine blessing. Even when later generations experienced decline and exile, they looked back to Solomon's time as the model of national greatness, a vision of unity, prosperity, and covenantal fulfillment. The legacy of Solomon's reign is therefore twofold. On one hand, it represents the height of Israel's monarchy, when Jerusalem was established as the spiritual and political centre, and when the temple became the heart of worship. On the other hand, it reveals the tensions inherent in monarchy, the burdens placed on the people, the compromises of foreign alliances, and the dangers of wealth and power. Solomon's achievements were monumental, but they were not without cost. His reign ended with a kingdom poised for division, foreshadowing the conflicts that would dominate the generations that followed. Yet the memory of Solomon endured, shaping hopes for restoration, inspiring wisdom traditions, and anchoring Israelite faith in the vision of a temple where heaven and earth met. The death of Solomon brought to an end the most celebrated era of unity and prosperity in Israelite memory, but it also opened the door to crisis and fragmentation. The very structures that had sustained Solomon's reign, his heavy taxation, his conscripted labour forces, his administrative centralisation, and his network of foreign alliances, had created deep fault lines within the kingdom. When he died, those tensions surfaced with full force. The tribes that had once rallied under David and Solomon now began to assert their independence, and the fragile unity of the kingdom collapsed into two separate realms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This division was not a temporary quarrel, but a lasting fracture that reshaped the history of the Israelites for centuries, producing parallel trajectories of politics, religion, and identity that would run side by side until both kingdoms fell to foreign empires. The succession of Solomon's son Rehoboam was the immediate trigger of the split. When the northern tribes assembled at Shechem to recognize him as king, they demanded relief from the burdens imposed during his father's reign. They sought lighter taxation and freedom from the forced labour that had fueled Solomon's building projects. Rehoboam, advised by his younger councillors, rejected their plea and threatened harsher rule, declaring that whereas his father had disciplined them with whips, he would do so with scorpions. This harsh response sparked rebellion. The northern tribes refused to acknowledge him as king, declaring, "What portion do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel!" They crowned Jeroboam, a former official under Solomon who had previously opposed his policies, as king over the north. Only Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming the southern kingdom with Jerusalem as its capital. This rupture reflected long-standing tensions between north and south. The northern tribes were more numerous, controlled fertile land, and had a history of asserting independence. The south, though smaller, had the advantage of Jerusalem, the Temple, and the Davidic dynasty. The division thus created two distinct polities: Israel in the north, with its shifting capitals at Shechem, Tirzah, and eventually Samaria, and Judah in the south, anchored in Jerusalem with continuity of David's line. Both kingdoms claimed legitimacy, but their identities developed along different trajectories, shaped by geography, politics, and religious practices. The once united Israel now became two rival states, sometimes allies but often adversaries, each seeking to assert dominance or survival in a volatile region. Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, faced the immediate challenge of securing his people's loyalty. Fearing that pilgrimages to Jerusalem for temple worship would draw the hearts of his subjects back to Judah, he established alternative sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan. Golden calves were set up as symbols of worship, recalling earlier traditions but condemned by later writers as idolatry. This act created a permanent religious divide between north and south, with Israel developing its own shrines, priests and rituals apart from Jerusalem's temple. For the Deuteronomistic historians who compiled much of the biblical narrative, Jeroboam's actions were seen as a grievous sin that set the northern kingdom on a path of disobedience. Yet from a historical perspective, his measures reflected practical politics, the need to establish independent religious institutions to solidify national identity apart from Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel quickly grew into the more powerful of the two. With greater resources, fertile land, and access to trade routes, Israel often overshadowed Judah. Its later capital, Samaria, became a strong and prosperous city, with impressive fortifications and palaces unearthed by archaeologists. Israel engaged actively in regional politics, forming alliances and waging wars against neighbouring states such as around Damascus and Moab. Judah, by contrast, remained smaller and weaker, often clinging to survival under the shadow of its larger neighbour. Yet Judah possessed one enduring advantage: the continuity of David's dynasty. While Israel experienced frequent coups, assassinations and dynastic changes, Judah's kingship remained within the house of David, lending it a stability that would shape later memories and theological interpretations. The division of the kingdom also reshaped religious identity. In Judah, the temple in Jerusalem became the uncontested centre of worship, reinforcing the bond between dynasty, cult and covenant. Priests and prophets emphasized loyalty to David's line and the sanctity of the temple as the dwelling of divine presence. In Israel, however, religion developed more diversely. The sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan became prominent, but local shrines and high places proliferated as well. Prophets arose in both kingdoms, often denouncing idolatry, injustice, and covenantal unfaithfulness. Figures such as Elijah and Elisha in the north became central to the prophetic tradition, challenging kings and calling the people back to fidelity. The division thus did not extinguish Israelite religion, but gave rise to diverse expressions shaped by regional realities. Archaeological evidence sheds light on the divergence of the two kingdoms. Excavations at Samaria reveal luxury items, ivory decorations and evidence of international trade, confirming the prosperity of the northern kingdom during its height. In Judah, by contrast, material culture reflects more modest development, with slower urbanization and smaller-scale fortifications. Yet Jerusalem's temple and its priestly institutions provided Judah with a powerful religious cohesion, absent in the north. Inscriptions such as the Mesha Stele confirm Israel's involvement in regional wars, while Assyrian records later describe both kingdoms as significant players in the geopolitics of the Levant. The material evidence confirms that the division was not merely internal squabbling, but the creation of two substantial and distinct states. The rivalry between Israel and Judah often turned violent. battles erupted over borders and influence, with periods of uneasy alliance punctuated by open conflict. Sometimes external threats forced cooperation, as when both kingdoms faced the rising power of Aram Damascus or the encroaching Assyrian Empire. Yet the underlying fracture remained. The prophetic tradition interpreted this division as both judgment and tragedy. Judgment for disobedience, yet tragedy because it fractured the unity of the people chosen by covenant. The dream of a united kingdom under David and Solomon became an idealized past, longed for but never restored in reality during the centuries of division. Theologically, the division deepened the tension between monarchy and covenant. In Judah, kings were judged by their fidelity to the temple and to the traditions of David. Even weak rulers could claim legitimacy by virtue of dynastic continuity. In Israel, kings were judged harshly for perpetuating Jeroboam's cultic innovations, and frequent dynastic changes undermined the stability of rule. Prophets played a crucial role in both kingdoms, often standing in opposition to royal power, reminding rulers that covenantal obligations outweighed political expedience. This dynamic reinforced the Israelite conviction that kingship, though necessary, was always conditional, subordinate to divine authority. The memory of the division became central to Israelite identity. For Judah, survival through continuity of David's line and the temple cult gave it a sense of chosenness, even in the face of weakness. For Israel, its prosperity and influence were real, but its instability and eventual destruction by Assyria confirmed the prophetic warnings of disobedience. Later generations, especially in the exile, would look back on the division as the beginning of decline, a failure to maintain unity and covenantal fidelity. The longing for reunification under a Davidic ruler became a recurring theme in prophetic hope, shaping the expectation of a messianic future that would restore what had been lost. The division of the kingdom thus represents both a political reality and a theological symbol. Politically, it reflects the inability to sustain the burdens of Solomon's system, the natural tensions between north and south, and the pressures of regional geopolitics. Theologically, it symbolizes the consequences of disobedience and the fragility of unity without fidelity. The once united kingdom of David and Solomon fractured into two rival states, each pursuing its own path, each embodying both promise and peril. Their parallel histories would unfold over the next 2 centuries, shaped by prophets, wars, reforms, and eventual destruction, but always overshadowed by the memory of the unity that had been lost. The 8th and 7th centuries BCE marked a decisive era in the story of the Israelites, remembered as the age when prophets rose to prominence and when the shadow of Assyria fell heavily over both Israel and Judah. The earlier centuries of division had already exposed the weakness of 2 rival kingdoms, but now the rise of the Assyrian Empire transformed their situation entirely. No longer were they small states contending only with one another or with local rivals such as Aram Damascus. They now faced the most formidable power of the ancient Near East, a kingdom that stretched from the Tigris to the Mediterranean, with armies, administrators, and imperial ambitions far beyond anything the Israelites had encountered. The response of the people and their rulers to this new reality, political compromise, military resistance, or theological interpretation, would determine their fate. In this crucible, the prophets emerged as voices of judgment and hope, interpreting the upheavals of their time not merely as accidents of history, but as signs of covenantal consequence. The northern kingdom of Israel was the first to feel the full force of Assyrian expansion. During the reign of Jeroboam II in the early 8th century, Israel experienced a final burst of prosperity and territorial control. Archaeology confirms that Samaria, Megiddo, and other northern cities flourished, with wealth reflected in ivory carvings, luxury goods, and large fortifications. But beneath the surface, inequality and injustice grew. The prophet Amos, active during this time, denounced the complacency of the elite who reclined on ivory beds, while the poor were sold for the price of sandals. Amos interpreted Israel's prosperity not as a sign of divine blessing, but as a test of covenant fidelity, one they were failing. He warned that the God who had delivered them from Egypt would not overlook their injustice, and that Assyria would be the instrument of judgment. Hosea, another northern prophet, echoed this theme, using the metaphor of unfaithfulness in marriage to describe Israel's idolatry and political opportunism. His anguished cries revealed both the depth of divine love and the seriousness of covenant betrayal. These prophetic voices were not welcomed in their time. Amos was told to flee back to Judah, and Hosea's message was ignored by kings who pursued shifting alliances to survive. Yet their words became foundational, preserved in written form and shaping later understandings of Israel's downfall. For indeed, their warning soon came true. The Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III began campaigns into the Levant in the mid-8th century, reducing states to vassalage and deporting populations. Israel's kings vacillated between paying tribute and rebelling, but their disunity sealed their fate. In 722 BCE, under Shalmaneser V and Sargon II, Samaria was besieged and captured. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent state. Its elite and large portions of its population were deported, scattered across the empire in accordance with Assyrian policy. These lost tribes vanished from history as distinct groups, absorbed into the wider world. The land of Israel was resettled by peoples from other regions, producing the mixed population that later came to be known as Samaritans. The fall of Samaria confirmed the prophet's warnings and became a lasting trauma in Israelite memory. Judah, the smaller southern kingdom, survived the Assyrian onslaught but was deeply affected by it. Refugees from the north fled south, swelling Jerusalem's population and bringing with them traditions, texts, and theological reflections. The prophet Isaiah emerged in this context, addressing kings in Jerusalem as they faced the overwhelming power of Assyria. During the reign of King Hezekiah, Judah rebelled against Assyrian control, refusing to pay tribute and seeking support from Egypt. The response was swift. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib invaded Judah, capturing fortified cities and laying siege to Jerusalem itself. Assyrian records, including the famous Taylor Prism, boast of the destruction of 46 walled towns and the deportation of hundreds of thousands. Yet Jerusalem was not taken. The biblical account attributes this to divine intervention, with the Assyrian army mysteriously struck down, while Assyrian records simply claim that Hezekiah was shut up in Jerusalem like a caged bird until he paid heavy tribute. Either way, Jerusalem survived, and this survival became a powerful symbol of divine protection, reinforcing the belief that the city of David and the Temple of Solomon enjoyed special status. Isaiah's message reflected this conviction, but with nuance. On the one hand, he proclaimed that Zion was secure because of divine promise. On the other, he warned that mere reliance on the temple without righteousness was empty. His vision combined immediate assurance with a long-term hope of a future king from David's line who would bring justice and peace. This messianic hope, born in the crucible of Assyrian threat, would reverberate through later centuries, shaping both Jewish and Christian expectations. Isaiah's eloquence and depth made him one of the most influential prophetic voices, balancing judgment with hope, realism with vision. The age of Assyrian domination also reshaped religion and society in Judah. Hezekiah initiated reforms, centralizing worship in Jerusalem and removing local shrines, seeking both to purify worship and to strengthen national unity. Archaeological evidence of these reforms includes the destruction of rural cult sites and the concentration of offerings in Jerusalem. Hezekiah also strengthened fortifications, with massive walls built to protect Jerusalem, sections of which can still be seen today. His preparations reflected the reality of living under the constant threat of imperial invasion. The prophet Micah, a contemporary of Isaiah, offered a complementary perspective, denouncing the exploitation of peasants by elites and warning that even Jerusalem could fall if injustice continued. His words served as a sobering counterpoint to triumphal confidence, reminding Judah that covenant fidelity was more than ritual. It demanded justice, mercy, and humility. The reign of Hezekiah's successor Manasseh marked a reversal. Submitting fully to Assyrian control, Manasseh allowed foreign cults to flourish in Jerusalem and engaged in practices condemned by prophetic tradition. His long reign provided stability, but at the cost of religious compromise and subservience to Assyria. For later generations, Manasseh epitomized disobedience, blamed for the disasters that eventually befell Judah. Yet his policies also reflected pragmatic survival in an age when resistance to Assyria seemed futile. The prophets continued to speak, their voices often marginalized but preserved for posterity, interpreting the political choices of kings as matters of covenant faithfulness rather than mere strategy. The broader context of the Assyrian Empire provides essential perspective. Assyria's policy of mass deportation and resettlement aimed to break resistance by uprooting populations and mixing cultures. This policy explains the disappearance of Israel's northern tribes and the lasting scars of exile in Israelite memory. Assyria also imposed heavy tribute, demanded loyalty oaths, and brutally suppressed rebellions, leaving behind vivid reliefs depicting conquests and punishments. The Israelites were a small people caught in the machinery of empire, their fate often determined by decisions in Nineveh rather than Jerusalem or Samaria. Yet their prophets interpreted these realities through the lens of covenant, insisting that history was not governed by empires alone, but by the God who held nations accountable. The fall of Israel and the survival of Judah under Assyrian domination created a profound theological shift. No longer could the Israelites assume that possession of the land was guaranteed. The destruction of Samaria demonstrated that disobedience led to judgment, even for the chosen people. At the same time, the survival of Jerusalem suggested that divine promise still endured, offering hope for the future. This dual lesson of judgment and hope became central to prophetic theology, shaping how later generations understood exile, restoration, and covenant. The prophets of this age gave voice to these tensions, preserving both the warnings of doom and the visions of renewal that sustained the people through crisis. As Assyria's power began to wane in the late 7th century, the stage was set for new challenges and opportunities. Judah would experience reform under King Josiah, a revival of covenantal fidelity and hopes of independence. Yet the spectre of another empire, Babylon, was already rising. The age of prophets and Assyrian domination thus represents a turning point. The fall of Israel, the testing of Judah, and the emergence of prophetic voices that interpreted history not as chaos but as covenantal drama. In their words, the Israelites found both the explanation of their suffering and the assurance of a future beyond empire. The Babylonian exile stands as one of the most traumatic and transformative periods in the entire history of the Israelites, a time when their land was devastated, their temple destroyed, and their leaders carried off into captivity. More than just a political disaster, it was a theological earthquake, forcing the people to confront questions about covenant, identity, and survival in ways that would reshape their faith forever. If the exodus from Egypt had been the great act of liberation that gave them birth as a people, the exile to Babylon was the catastrophe that nearly unmade them, yet ultimately pushed them toward deeper reflection, new forms of worship, and the preservation of traditions that ensured their survival. The story of the exile is therefore not only one of the loss, but also of resilience, creativity, and transformation, an experience that forged Judaism into the durable faith it would become. The crisis began in the late 7th century BCE, as the Assyrian Empire that had dominated the region for centuries finally collapsed. Babylon, under the leadership of Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II, rose as the new superpower. The Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE confirmed Babylonian supremacy over the Levant, bringing Judah into its orbit as a vassal state. The king of Judah, Jehoiakim, vacillated between loyalty to Babylon and seeking support from Egypt, reflecting the desperate calculations of a small kingdom caught between rival empires. This indecision proved fatal. When Jehoiakim rebelled, Babylon responded with force. In 597 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, deposed King Jehoiakim, and carried him along with leading officials and artisans into exile. A new king, Zedekiah, was installed as a Babylonian puppet, but he too eventually rebelled, hoping for Egyptian aid. The response was devastating. In 586 BCE, Babylonian armies returned, breached Jerusalem's walls, burned the temple, destroyed the palace, and carried thousands more into captivity. The Davidic monarchy, the temple, and the independence of Judah were gone. The destruction of the temple was the most shattering blow. For centuries, the temple built by Solomon had been the focal point of worship, the symbol of divine presence, and the anchor of national identity. Its loss raised agonizing questions. Had their God been defeated by Babylon's gods? Was the covenant broken? Could worship continue without sacrifice and without a sanctuary? The exile forced the Israelites to grapple with these theological dilemmas. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel interpreted the catastrophe as judgment for disobedience, idolatry, and injustice. They insisted that the God of Israel had not been defeated but had used Babylon as an instrument of discipline. This interpretation preserved the sovereignty of their God even in the face of defeat, transforming humiliation into a theological explanation that both acknowledged guilt and held out hope of restoration. Life in exile presented new challenges. The exiles were settled in Babylonian territory, not as slaves in chains but as displaced communities. Archaeological discoveries such as the Al-Yahudu tablets provide glimpses of Jewish life in Babylon, recording land leases, contracts, and economic activity. These documents show that many exiles adapted to their new environment, building houses, planting gardens, and engaging in trade, just as Jeremiah had advised in his letter urging them to seek the welfare of the cities where they lived. Yet adaptation did not mean assimilation. The exiles maintained their identity through genealogies, traditions, and new forms of worship that did not depend on the temple. Synagogue gatherings, prayer, and the study of law began to emerge as alternative means of preserving faith. These innovations laid the foundation for the Judaism of later centuries, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of displacement. Ezekiel, one of the exiles, offered a radical vision that redefined divine presence. In his visions, he saw the glory of the God of Israel departing from the temple before its destruction, moving eastward with the people into exile. This vision shattered the assumption that divine presence was confined to Jerusalem, affirming instead that their God could be worshipped anywhere. Ezekiel also envisioned a future restoration, complete with a new temple and renewed covenant. His symbolic actions, vivid imagery, and promises of a new heart and spirit gave the exiles both explanation and hope. The experience of displacement rather than destroying faith expanded it, teaching the people that their God was not limited by geography or institutions. The exile also transformed attitudes toward the law and scripture. Without the temple, sacrifice was impossible, but the covenant could be preserved through obedience to Torah. The emphasis shifted from ritual in a central sanctuary to daily faithfulness in life and community. Traditions were collected, edited, and transmitted with new urgency, ensuring that identity could survive even without land or temple. The priestly writings, with their focus on law, purity, and ritual order, reflect this exilic context, seeking to preserve holiness in a time of loss. Genealogies became crucial as exiles maintained their lineage in hopes of eventual return. Memory of the past was carefully recorded, both to explain the disaster and to prepare for the future. The exile thus became a catalyst for the formation of scripture, embedding theological reflection into written texts that would endure. Not all Israelites were exiled. Many remained in the land, including peasants and those considered less threatening by the Babylonians. These people experienced their own trauma, living amid ruins, under foreign governors, and with a sense of abandonment. Tensions developed between those left behind and those taken away, each viewing themselves as the true remnant. Later, when exiles returned under Persian rule, these tensions resurfaced in conflicts over authority, purity, and identity. The exile was therefore not only a geographical displacement, but also a division within the people themselves, creating fractures that would echo for generations. The Psalms of exile capture the emotional depth of this experience. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. These laments express grief, longing, and defiance, refusing to forget Jerusalem even in a foreign land. They also reveal the inner struggle of maintaining identity amid pressures to assimilate. The exiles clung to memory, refusing to let go of their hope that one day they would return. This resilience became a defining feature of Jewish identity, enabling survival through later dispersions and exiles. The Babylonian captivity thus established a pattern of endurance that would sustain the people through every future crisis. From a broader historical perspective, the exile reflects the dynamics of empire and small states. Babylon's policy of deportation aimed to break resistance by uprooting elites and integrating them into the imperial system. For most peoples, this led to assimilation and disappearance. The remarkable fact about the Israelites is that they survived. Their survival was not inevitable, but the result of conscious choices, preserving tradition, adapting worship, and interpreting their history through the lens of covenant. The exile transformed them from a nation tied to land and temple into a people whose identity could endure without either. This transformation ensured that even when the temple was destroyed again centuries later, the people and their faith would continue. The exile also gave rise to renewed hopes for restoration. Prophets envisioned a return to the land, a rebuilding of the temple, and the renewal of David's dynasty. These hopes sustained the exiles and shaped their prayers. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and allowed exiles to return, many saw this as the fulfillment of prophetic promises. Yet even for those who returned, the exile left permanent marks. The trauma of destruction, the loss of the temple, and the experience of living in a foreign land reshaped theology, worship, and identity. The exile could never be undone. It became part of who they were, a memory that would forever define their understanding of themselves and their God. The Babylonian exile was thus both catastrophe and turning point. It destroyed old certainties but created new possibilities. It stripped away land, temple, and monarchy, but it deepened commitment to covenant, scripture, and hope. It scattered the people, but it also preserved them, teaching them to adapt and endure. Out of the trauma of exile came the transformation that ensured their survival and prepared them for the next stages of history. The Israelites emerged not destroyed but renewed, carrying forward a faith that would sustain them through Persia, Greece, Rome, and beyond. The fall of Babylon to the armies of Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Israelites, one that was no less decisive than the exile itself. The Persian conquest did not simply change rulers, it reshaped the entire landscape of the Near East. The Babylonians had enforced their empire with brutality, deportations, and the suppression of local identities. The Persians, by contrast, adopted policies of tolerance and restoration, allowing displaced peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their sanctuaries. For the Israelites, this meant the extraordinary possibility of going back to Judah, of restoring Jerusalem, and of building a new temple to replace the one destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. This return was not a full reversal of exile. Many remained in Babylon, and those who returned faced hardship and division. But it represented a turning point. The Second Temple community was born, a society rebuilt on ruins, shaped by memory of catastrophe and sustained by covenantal hope. The decree of Cyrus is remembered as the beginning of restoration. According to biblical tradition, Cyrus acknowledged the God of heaven and authorized the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Whether or not Cyrus personally phrased his decree in Israelite theological language, his broader policy is well attested in inscriptions such as the Cyrus Cylinder, which proclaims his restoration of temples and repatriation of peoples throughout the empire. For the Israelites, Cyrus was seen as an instrument of divine will, even called the Anointed One in the book of Isaiah, a title usually reserved for their own kings. This striking designation shows how profoundly his policies were interpreted through the lens of covenant history. A foreign emperor had become the unexpected agent of deliverance, echoing earlier acts of salvation, yet in a wholly new political context. The return itself was not simple or complete. Only a portion of the exiles chose to make the journey back to Judah, while many remained in Babylon, where Jewish communities would continue to thrive for centuries. Those who did return found a land devastated, its cities in ruins, its agricultural base weakened, and its population diminished. Jerusalem, once a proud capital, was little more than rubble. The Temple Mount lay desolate. The people who had remained in the land during the exile had developed their own ways of survival, leading to tension with the newcomers who returned with claims of legitimacy based on lineage and covenant. These divisions complicated the process of rebuilding, as community identity had to be renegotiated between those who came back and those who had never left. The initial focus of the returnees was the rebuilding of the temple. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a descendant of the Davidic line, and Joshua the high priest, the altar was re-established and sacrifices resumed. Laying the foundation of the new temple was both a practical and symbolic act, signalling that worship would once again centre on Jerusalem. Yet the project faced delays, opposition from neighbouring peoples, and discouragement among the builders. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah played crucial roles in urging the community forward, proclaiming that the temple must be completed and that divine blessing would accompany their efforts. Haggai encouraged the people to see the rebuilding not as a minor restoration, but as the beginning of a greater glory, while Zechariah offered visions of renewal and the crowning of Zerubbabel as a messianic figure. Their words sustained the fragile community through setbacks, reinforcing the belief that restoration was not merely political, but theological. The Second Temple, completed around 515 BCE, was far humbler than Solomon's grand edifice, yet its significance was immense. It restored sacrificial worship, re-established priestly roles, and provided a visible centre for the community. The temple became the heart of identity, even in its modest form, for it represented continuity with the past and hope for the future. The memory of its dedication, with joy and tears mingled, reflects the complexity of the moment. Joy at restoration, sorrow at the recognition that the new temple could not match the glory of the old. Yet its very existence ensured that worship could continue, anchoring the community in covenantal practice and marking the rebirth of Jerusalem as a spiritual centre. Persian administration shaped the life of the Second Temple community. Judah became a small province, Yehud, within the vast Persian Empire. Governed by local officials under imperial oversight, it lacked political independence, but enjoyed a degree of autonomy in religious affairs. This arrangement allowed the Israelites to rebuild their institutions while recognizing Persian sovereignty. Tribute had to be paid, but within those limits the community could shape its own identity. This period thus laid the groundwork for a Judaism that could exist under foreign rule without losing its distinctiveness, a pattern that would recur throughout later history. The roles of Ezra and Nehemiah in the mid-5th century were pivotal in consolidating this identity. Ezra, a scribe and priest, is remembered for bringing the Book of the Law to Jerusalem and reading it publicly to the people. This act symbolized the centrality of Torah as the foundation of community life, shifting emphasis from monarchy and land to law and covenant. The people responded with confession, repentance, and renewed commitment, underscoring that survival and identity depended on obedience to divine instruction. Nehemiah, serving as governor under Persian authority, focused on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, restoring security and civic pride. His leadership combined practical administration with spiritual reform, confronting corruption, economic exploitation, and intermarriage with foreigners. Together, Ezra and Nehemiah forged a community defined by law, worship, and separation from surrounding peoples, ensuring cohesion in a fragile environment. The tension between inclusion and separation defined much of the Second Temple community. On the one hand, prophets had envisioned Jerusalem as a light to the nations, a place where foreigners would come to worship. On the other hand, the experience of exile and the need to preserve identity in a hostile environment pushed the community toward exclusivism. Intermarriage with surrounding peoples was condemned, and the returnees asserted their authority over those who had remained in the land, sometimes excluding them from temple building. These tensions reflected the complex reality of a people trying to balance openness and distinctiveness, survival and mission. The decisions made in this period would shape Jewish identity for centuries, establishing patterns of boundary keeping that ensured continuity, but also created friction with neighbours. Archaeological evidence from Persian period Judah confirms the modest scale of restoration. Jerusalem was a small town compared to its former glory, with a population likely in the tens of thousands at most. Pottery, inscriptions, and administrative seals attest to renewed life, but the grandeur of earlier times was absent. The economy was limited, dependent on agriculture and small-scale trade. Yet within these modest circumstances, the foundations of Judaism were laid. The focus on Torah, the centrality of the temple, and the structures of community life were forged not in wealth or power, but in persistence and faith. The Second Temple community was small but resilient, carrying forward traditions that would endure long after empires had fallen. The prophets of the post-exilic period added further depth to this identity. Malachi, likely one of the last prophets, criticized priestly corruption, lax worship, and social injustice, calling the people to renewed faithfulness. His warnings about offering blemished sacrifices and neglecting covenantal obligations showed that even in restoration, complacency was a danger. Yet his promise of a coming messenger who would prepare the way for the Lord kept alive the hope of future fulfillment. The post-exilic prophets thus combined critique with vision, ensuring that the community did not settle into mere ritual, but remained oriented toward covenantal fidelity and expectation. The experience of return under Persia transformed Israelite religion and society in lasting ways. The monarchy was gone, replaced by priestly and scribal leadership. The temple was rebuilt, but Torah became the ultimate foundation of identity. Prophets still spoke, but written scripture began to take precedence as the enduring voice of authority. The people were no longer defined primarily by land or king, but by covenant, worship, and law. This transformation ensured that even under foreign domination, they could survive as a distinct people. The Second Temple period thus represents not merely a restoration of the past, but the birth of a new form of community, one that could endure exile, diaspora, and empire without losing its core identity. The Persian era also left a lasting imprint on Jewish thought. Concepts of cosmic struggle, angels, and eschatology began to appear more prominently, influenced in part by Persian religion. The expectation of a future restoration, a messianic figure, and a final judgment gained momentum, enriching the theological landscape. These ideas would continue to develop in the centuries that followed, providing the backdrop for later apocalyptic traditions. The Second Temple community, though small and vulnerable, was fertile ground for these new theological currents, which would shape both Judaism and Christianity in later times. The return under Persia was therefore not the end of exile, but a new beginning. The trauma of Babylon had stripped away old certainties, but Persia's policies allowed for reconstruction on new foundations. Jerusalem was rebuilt, the temple restored, and Torah elevated to central importance. The community that emerged was smaller, poorer, and less politically powerful than the kingdom of David and Solomon, yet it was stronger in identity and more resilient in faith. This community would endure through the coming centuries of Hellenistic and Roman domination, preserving its traditions, interpreting its history, and awaiting fulfillment of its hopes. The Second Temple community was the seedbed of Judaism, as it would be known henceforth, a faith rooted in covenant, centered on law and worship, and capable of surviving without political sovereignty. The Persian period had given the Israelites a measure of stability and the chance to rebuild, but the arrival of Hellenistic power in the Near East introduced pressures of a new kind. Where Persia had governed through tolerance and allowed subject peoples to maintain their traditions, the conquests of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BCE brought not just new rulers, but a cultural force that sought to penetrate every aspect of life. Hellenism, the spread of Greek language, art, architecture, philosophy, and religious practice, reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean. For the Jews of the Second Temple community, this influence presented both opportunity and crisis. Some embraced aspects of Greek culture, finding ways to adapt and thrive under new conditions. Others resisted, seeing assimilation as a threat to covenantal identity. The tension between these responses would eventually erupt into conflict, culminating in the Maccabean Revolt, one of the most dramatic and formative struggles in Jewish history. Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire between 334 and 323 BCE transformed the political landscape. After his death, his empire fractured into competing kingdoms ruled by his generals, the Diadochi. Judah, now a small province, became a pawn caught between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. For the 1st century after Alexander, Judah was largely under Ptolemaic rule. The Ptolemies, like the Persians before them, were relatively tolerant, interested primarily in taxation and stability. During this time, Jewish communities flourished not only in Judah, but also in Egypt, especially in Alexandria, where a vibrant diaspora developed. It was in this context that the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, producing the Septuagint, which allowed Jewish tradition to be accessible in the lingua franca of the age, and laid the groundwork for later cross-cultural interactions. Hellenistic culture, however, was more than political dominance. It was a pervasive way of life. Greek became the language of administration, trade, and intellectual exchange. Cities were rebuilt along Greek lines with gymnasia, theatres, and temples dedicated to Greek gods. Architecture, coinage, and even burial practices reflected Hellenistic influence. For many Jews, particularly the elites, adopting aspects of Greek culture was a path to social advancement and integration into the wider world. Participation in gymnasia, use of Greek names, and appreciation of Greek learning became increasingly common. Yet for others, these changes represented a betrayal of covenantal identity, a turning away from Torah and temple toward the idols of foreign culture. This divide between Hellenizers and traditionalists deepened over time, creating internal conflict that was as significant as external pressures. The Seleucid conquest of Judah in the early 2nd century BCE intensified these tensions. Initially, Seleucid rulers continued the pragmatic policies of earlier empires, but as their own power became strained by wars and internal challenges, they sought to exert greater control. Antiochus IV, or Epiphanes, who came to power in 175 BCE, pursued aggressive policies of Hellenization. He interfered in the appointment of high priests, favouring those more aligned with Greek culture and loyal to Seleucid interests. Wealthy and Hellenized elites welcomed these changes, while others saw them as corruptions of the temple and betrayal of covenant. The situation escalated in 167 BCE, when Antiochus, responding to unrest in Jerusalem and possibly seeking to unify his empire through religious conformity, desecrated the temple outlawed key Jewish practices such as circumcision and Sabbath observance and dedicated the sanctuary to Zeus. This act struck at the heart of Jewish identity, transforming political domination into religious persecution. The response was rebellion. In the small town of Modane, a priest named Mattathias refused to offer sacrifice to Greek gods and instead struck down the official enforcing the decree. With his sons, he fled to the hills and began a guerrilla resistance. After Mattathias' death, leadership passed to his son Judas, later called Maccabeus, the Hammer. Under his leadership, the revolt gathered momentum. The Maccabees used guerrilla tactics, striking Seleucid forces in the hills and countryside, exploiting their knowledge of terrain and their zeal for covenant. Their victories, though improbable against the might of a Hellenistic army, galvanized support and inspired others to join. Over several years of struggle, Judas and his brothers achieved remarkable successes, culminating in the recapture of Jerusalem and the rededication of the temple in 164 BCE. The rededication of the temple became a defining moment, celebrated thereafter in the festival of Hanukkah. According to tradition, when the temple was cleansed and the menorah relit, there was only enough consecrated oil for one day, yet it miraculously lasted 8 days until new oil could be prepared. Whether or not this detail reflects historical fact, the memory of Hanukkah symbolized divine approval of the revolt and the restoration of proper worship. The festival became an enduring marker of identity, celebrating not only military victory but the preservation of covenantal faith in the face of persecution. The revolt demonstrated that survival was not only possible, but achievable through resistance, courage, and trust in divine support. The Maccabean revolt did not end with Judas. After his death in battle, leadership passed to his brothers Jonathan and Simon, who consolidated control and eventually secured political independence. In 142 BCE, Simon achieved recognition of Jewish autonomy, marking the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty, named after the family of Mattathias. For the first time since the Babylonian conquest, the Jews enjoyed political sovereignty. Jerusalem was restored as the capital, the temple as the centre of worship, and Torah as the foundation of national life. This achievement was extraordinary, a reversal of centuries of foreign domination, and it was celebrated as a fulfillment of covenantal hope. Yet it also introduced new challenges, as the Hasmoneans became rulers in their own right, blending priestly authority with kingship and facing the same temptations of power and compromise that had plagued earlier monarchs. The impact of Hellenism did not disappear with the Maccabean victory. Greek culture remained influential, shaping language, administration, and even architecture in the Hasmonean state. The struggle between Hellenizers and traditionalists continued, with new divisions emerging between different groups within Judaism. The Pharisees emphasized strict observance of Torah and oral traditions, while the Sadducees, associated with priestly elites, maintained closer ties to the temple and political authority. Other groups, such as the Essenes, withdrew into separatist communities, awaiting divine intervention. These divisions reflected the lasting impact of Hellenistic culture and the deep debates over how to live faithfully under its influence. The revolt had preserved Jewish identity, but it had also left unresolved the question of how that identity should engage with the wider world. Archaeological evidence confirms both the struggle and the transformation of this period. Coins minted by the Hasmoneans proclaim both political independence and religious themes, combining symbols of sovereignty with covenantal imagery. Fortresses and expanded urban centres reflect the consolidation of power, while inscriptions and artefacts show the persistence of Greek language and culture alongside Jewish distinctiveness. The dual reality of resistance and adaptation is evident in the material record, just as it is in the textual traditions. The Maccabean revolt was not simply a rejection of Hellenism, but a negotiation with it, asserting boundaries while inevitably absorbing elements of the surrounding culture. the memory of the Maccabees became deeply ingrained in Jewish identity. Their courage, their zeal for Torah, and their success in restoring the temple were celebrated as acts of faithfulness. Yet their story also carried lessons about the dangers of power, for the Hasmonean dynasty that followed would face its own struggles with corruption, factionalism, and foreign entanglements. Still, the revolt demonstrated that Jewish identity could withstand even the most aggressive attempts at erasure, and that resistance rooted in covenantal faith could triumph over empire. The story of the Maccabees thus became a model for future generations, inspiring hope and courage in times of persecution. The age of Hellenistic influence and the Maccabean revolt was therefore a period of both crisis and creativity. Hellenism challenged Jewish identity, offering allure and imposing pressure, but it also provoked a profound reassertion of covenantal faith. The revolt preserved the distinctiveness of the Second Temple community, restored political independence, and gave rise to new forms of religious expression. It also introduced enduring debates over the balance between adaptation and resistance, debates that would continue under Roman rule and beyond. In this crucible of cultural confrontation and national struggle, Judaism was both tested and renewed, emerging more complex, more diverse, and more resilient than before. The establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty following the Maccabean revolt marked the beginning of a rare and remarkable period in Israelite history. Political independence after centuries of subjugation under foreign empires. For nearly 400 years, since the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, the people of Judah had lived under the domination of powers greater than themselves: Babylon, Persia, the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids. Now, through the courage and determination of the Maccabees, they had secured autonomy. Under the leadership of Simon, the last surviving son of Mattathias, the revolt gave birth to a dynasty that would rule for about a century. This dynasty, known as the Hasmoneans, presided over a period of both remarkable achievements and growing contradictions. It expanded territory, asserted sovereignty, and fostered religious identity. Yet it also generated internal divisions, power struggles, and compromises that revealed the complexities of ruling in a Hellenistic world. Simon's recognition as both high priest and ethnarch in 142 BCE established the Hasmonean state. His dual role combined religious and political authority, breaking with earlier traditions that had separated priestly functions from kingship. For many, this fusion of roles was troubling, for the priesthood was traditionally descended from Aaron, while kingship had belonged to the house of David. Yet the realities of the revolt and the need for strong leadership elevated Simon and his descendants to a position that merged sacred and secular power. This blending of priesthood and monarchy would remain a defining feature of the Hasmonean dynasty, one that brought both strength and controversy. The family that had risen to defend Torah and temple now became rulers themselves, facing the same temptations and dilemmas as any monarchs of the ancient Near East. Under Simon and his successors, the Hasmonean state expanded significantly. Territories once lost were recovered, and new lands were added through conquest. John Hyrcanus, who ruled from 134 to 104 BCE, carried out campaigns that extended Jewish control over Idumea, Samaria, and parts of Galilee. These expansions were not merely territorial but also religious, as Hyrcanus enforced Jewish practices upon conquered peoples, including circumcision. This policy of forced Judaization, unprecedented in earlier history, reflected the growing intertwining of political power and religious identity. While it expanded the influence of Judaism, it also sowed seeds of resentment and conflict. For those who accepted Jewish practices under compulsion often remained culturally distinct and later contested their status within the community. The Hasmonean rulers also transformed Jerusalem. The city was fortified, the temple restored to greater splendor, and political institutions strengthened. Coinage minted during this period displayed Jewish symbols alongside inscriptions, asserting both sovereignty and identity. Archaeological remains from this era reveal expanded urbanization, fortifications and ritual baths, all reflecting a society that was both consolidating power and emphasizing religious distinctiveness. The dynasty sought to present itself as the fulfillment of the covenantal hope preserved through centuries of struggle, embodying the restoration of Jewish sovereignty in the land of their ancestors. Yet alongside these achievements came new challenges that revealed the fragility of their power. Internally, the Hasmonean dynasty faced growing tensions among different factions of Jewish society. The Pharisees, emphasizing strict observance of Torah and oral tradition, often clashed with the Sadducees, who were closely tied to the priestly and aristocratic class. The Essenes, another group, withdrew from mainstream society altogether, rejecting what they saw as corruption in the temple and awaiting divine intervention to establish true righteousness. These divisions reflected deeper questions about identity, authority, and the nature of covenantal faith. The Hasmonean rulers often aligned with the Sadducees, reinforcing their own authority as both kings and priests, but this alignment alienated large portions of the population. The seeds of later turmoil under Roman rule were already being planted in these internal conflicts. The reign of Alexander Jannaeus from 103 to 76 BCE epitomized both the power and the problems of the Hasmonean dynasty. A skilled warrior, he expanded the kingdom to its greatest extent, controlling much of the territory once held by David and Solomon. Yet his reign was marked by brutal suppression of opposition. When Pharisees opposed his rule, he responded with executions and repression, deepening the divide between ruler and people. His blending of high priestly role with kingship was particularly offensive to those who saw it as illegitimate. The use of violence against fellow Jews revealed how far the Hasmoneans had moved from their origins as defenders of covenantal faith. What had begun as a movement to preserve Torah and resist foreign oppression now looked to many like another oppressive regime. His widow Salome Alexandra, who ruled after his death, attempted to heal some of these divisions. Her reign, from 76 to 67 BCE, is remembered as a period of relative peace and reconciliation, in which the Pharisees gained greater influence and the kingdom enjoyed stability. Yet the succession struggles that followed her death plunged the dynasty into renewed conflict. Her sons, Hyrcanus Thect and Aristobulus Thect, fought bitterly for control, drawing in foreign powers to support their claims. This fratricidal strife revealed the weakening of the dynasty and set the stage for the loss of independence. The family that had once thrown off foreign domination now invited it back, undermining their own achievements. The involvement of Rome proved decisive. As the internal conflict between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus intensified, both appealed to Pompey, the Roman general who was advancing through the eastern Mediterranean. In 63 BCE, Pompey intervened, besieged Jerusalem, and entered the Holy of Holies in the temple, an act of profound sacrilege in Jewish eyes. From that moment, Judea became a client state of Rome. Though the Hasmonean dynasty continued in diminished form for a time, true independence was lost. The century of sovereignty achieved by the Maccabees ended not with glorious resistance, but with internal division and foreign domination. The very dynasty that had arisen in defense of faith and freedom had collapsed under the weight of ambition, factionalism, and reliance on outside powers. The legacy of the Hasmonean dynasty is therefore deeply ambivalent. On the one hand, it represented an extraordinary achievement, the restoration of Jewish independence, the expansion of territory, the flourishing of Jerusalem, and the preservation of identity in the face of Hellenistic pressures. It gave the Jewish people a sense of pride, hope, and tangible sovereignty, proving that resistance could succeed and that covenantal identity could be defended by political power. On the other hand, the dynasty also revealed the dangers of power. Its rulers blurred the lines between priesthood and kingship, alienated segments of their own people, engaged in coercive religious policies, and ultimately destroyed their unity through civil strife. Their end under Roman oversight became a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of power could compromise the very faith they had set out to defend. Archaeology provides vivid evidence of the Hasmonean era. Fortresses such as Hyrcania, Alexandrian, and Machaerus demonstrate the military might and strategic control of the dynasty. The remains of ritual baths, ossuaries, and other religious artifacts reflect the increasing emphasis on purity and identity. Coins bearing inscriptions such as Yehonatan the High Priest illustrate the self-presentation of Hasmonean rulers as both religious and political leaders. These material remains confirm both the accomplishments and contradictions of the dynasty, showing a society that was at once vibrant and divided, flourishing and fragile. In the long arc of Jewish history, the Hasmonean dynasty stands as both triumph and tragedy. It proved that Jewish sovereignty was possible even in an age of empires, but it also showed how fragile such sovereignty could be when undermined by internal conflict and dependence on external powers. The memory of the Maccabees lived on as heroes of resistance, celebrated for their courage and faith. The Hasmonean rulers, however, were remembered with more ambivalence, admired for their achievements but criticised for their compromises. Their century of independence became both a source of pride and a reminder of the dangers of power without unity or humility. As the Hasmonean dynasty collapsed into Roman oversight, the stage was set for the next and perhaps most defining era of Jewish history, life under Roman rule. The struggles, divisions and hopes of the Hasmonean period would carry forward, shaping the context in which Rome's dominance, Herod's reign, and the eventual destruction of the Second Temple would unfold. The Hasmonean century was brief, but it left an indelible imprint, both inspiring and warning future generations about the meaning of sovereignty, the cost of division, and the enduring call to covenantal faithfulness. The arrival of Rome in the Eastern Mediterranean transformed the fate of the Jewish people in ways as profound as Babylon or Persia had centuries earlier. The Roman Republic, already expanding through the Mediterranean world, entered the region during the 1st century BCE at a time when the Hasmonean dynasty was unravelling from within. The appeal of warring Hasmonean brothers to Pompey the Great invited Roman arbitration, but what began as intervention quickly became domination. In 63 BCE, Pompey marched into Jerusalem, besieged the city, and entered the Holy of Holies of the Temple, a shocking desecration that marked the effective end of Jewish political independence. From that moment onward, Rome was a permanent presence, first through indirect rule and later through direct imperial control. The Herodian age emerged out of this Roman order, with Herod the Great installed as king under Roman approval. His reign embodied both the grandeur and the contradictions of Jewish life under Rome. Monumental building projects, expanded political influence, and the beautification of the temple alongside repression, violence, and deep tensions within Jewish society. The Hasmonean dynasty had collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. Civil wars between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II had divided the people and weakened their capacity for self-rule. Pompey's intervention decided the conflict, leaving Hyrcanus as high priest but stripping him of true sovereignty. Judea became a client kingdom of Rome, required to pay tribute and submit to Roman oversight. The Romans, pragmatic in their approach, left local institutions in place but ensured loyalty through military presence and political manipulation. This arrangement preserved the temple cult and allowed a measure of autonomy, but the sense of lost independence never faded, fueling resentment that simmered beneath the surface for decades. Into this volatile situation stepped Herod, a figure whose legacy would dominate Jewish history for a generation. Born around 73 BCE, Herod was of Idumean descent, a people forcibly integrated into Judaism under the Hasmoneans. His father, Antipater, had risen to prominence as an advisor to Hyrcanus II and secured Roman favour. Herod himself was appointed governor of Galilee at a young age, demonstrating both administrative skill and ruthless efficiency. When civil war erupted between Roman leaders Julius Caesar, Pompey, and later Mark Antony and Octavian, Herod manoeuvred carefully, aligning with whichever faction could secure his position. His political agility allowed him to survive shifting Roman politics, and in 40 BCE, the Roman Senate officially declared him King of the Jews. With Roman military support, Herod consolidated his power, defeating rivals and securing control of Judea by 37 BCE. His kingship was thus rooted not in popular acceptance but in Roman patronage, making him both ruler and client of Rome. Herod's reign, lasting until 4th BCE, was marked by extraordinary building projects that reshaped Judea and left a legacy visible even today. His most famous achievement was the expansion and renovation of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Determined to win legitimacy among his subjects and leave a monument to rival the grandeur of other ancient temples, Herod undertook an ambitious reconstruction. The temple complex was expanded to immense proportions, with massive retaining walls, parts of which remain today as the Western Wall, creating a platform that became one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. The sanctuary itself was adorned with white marble and gold, dazzling in appearance. For many Jews, the temple Herod built was a source of pride, a restored house of worship more magnificent than Solomon's original. Yet for others, the irony of a king imposed by Rome and of Idumean descent, overseeing the rebuilding of the sacred centre, only deepened suspicion and resentment. Herod's architectural projects extended far beyond Jerusalem. He rebuilt cities such as Caesarea Maritima, complete with a deep-water harbour, amphitheatre, and aqueducts, making it a hub of trade and Roman administration. He fortified Masada, Herodium, and other strongholds, ensuring his control over both people and territory. He sponsored the construction of palaces, public buildings, and fortifications across the land, transforming Judea into a realm that bore the marks of both Jewish tradition and Hellenistic Roman grandeur. These projects reflected Herod's ambition to rival the great monarchs of antiquity, to leave behind a legacy of splendour that would cement his reputation in history. Archaeological remains confirm the scale of his achievements, showing how his vision reshaped the landscape of Judea into one of the most architecturally sophisticated provinces in the empire. Yet Herod's reign was not remembered solely for grandeur. His rule was characterized by paranoia, cruelty, and repression. Ever conscious of his tenuous legitimacy, he eliminated rivals with ruthless efficiency. Members of the Hasmonean family, including his own wife Mariamne and their children, were executed on charges of conspiracy. Aristocratic opponents and perceived threats were removed without hesitation. His loyalty to Rome ensured his survival, but it also reinforced his status as a foreign-backed ruler, distrusted by many of his subjects. The biblical tradition preserves stories of Herod's brutality, such as the massacre of infants in Bethlehem, though this specific account may reflect more symbolic memory than documented history. Nonetheless, it captures the essence of how he was perceived, a king of great power and achievement, but one feared and hated by many of his people. The religious dynamics of the Herodian age reflected these contradictions. The temple stood in magnificence, yet its priesthood was increasingly tied to Herod's appointments and Roman approval, undermining its spiritual credibility in the eyes of many. Sectarian divisions deepened. The Sadducees, aligned with priestly aristocracy and political power, cooperated with Herod and Rome to preserve their influence. The Pharisees, emphasizing Torah observance and traditions of the people, resisted accommodation and maintained distance, earning popular respect. The Essenes withdrew altogether, forming separatist communities in the desert, where they awaited divine deliverance and recorded texts such as those found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Zealots, emerging later, would call for armed resistance, seeing both Herod and Rome as illegitimate usurpers. Jewish society was thus fragmented, with no single vision of how to live faithfully under Roman rule. The Herodian age crystallized these divisions, setting the stage for future conflicts. Despite his unpopularity, Herod succeeded in securing stability. His reign brought relative peace, economic growth, and monumental infrastructure. He skillfully balanced Roman expectations with local sensibilities, ensuring that Judea remained loyal while retaining a measure of distinct identity. He minted coins that avoided graven images offensive to Jewish sensibilities, even as he filled his cities with Greco-Roman architecture. He supported the Olympic Games and built temples to Roman gods outside Judea, displaying loyalty to Rome while avoiding direct provocation of Jewish tradition within the Holy Land. This balancing act reflected both his pragmatism and his contradictions, a ruler who navigated two worlds but never fully belonged to either. Herod's death in 4 BCE unleashed the tensions he had kept in check. His kingdom was divided among his sons, Archelaus over Judea, Antipas over Galilee, and Philip over northern territories. None matched their father's political skill or power. Archelaus proved especially incompetent, leading to his removal by Rome and the direct incorporation of Judea as a Roman province in 6 CE. This shift intensified Roman presence, with governors appointed to oversee the region, the most famous of whom would later be Pontius Pilate. The Herodian age thus ended with the fragmentation of Herod's kingdom and the deepening of Roman control, a trajectory that would lead inexorably toward revolt and destruction in the 1st century CE. The legacy of Herod the Great remains contested. On one hand, he was a master builder whose architectural achievements transformed Judea and left monuments of enduring significance. His expansion of the temple provided a magnificent centre for Jewish worship, remembered with awe even by later generations. On the other hand, his cruelty, paranoia, and dependence on Rome earned him hatred among his people. He embodied both the possibilities and the perils of Jewish life under Rome, prosperity and grandeur coupled with compromise and subjugation. His reign symbolized the uneasy balance between adaptation to empire and preservation of identity, a balance that would prove increasingly unstable in the decades that followed. The Herodian age, then, was both culmination and prelude. It marked the height of Jewish integration into the Roman world, with monumental achievements and relative stability, yet it also exposed the fractures of society and the contradictions of rule under foreign domination. The tensions between Rome, Herodian rulers, priestly elites, Pharisees, Essenes, and common people would only grow, setting the stage for revolt, destruction, and yet another transformation in Jewish identity. The grandeur of Herod's temple would stand for decades as a symbol of power and devotion, but it would also become the focal point of conflict, eventually consumed by the flames of Rome. The period of Second Temple Judaism, stretching from the rebuilding of the temple under Persian rule in the late 6th century BCE to its destruction by the Romans in 70 CE, represents one of the most dynamic and formative eras in Jewish history. It was a time of restoration and trauma, adaptation and resistance, creativity and division. During these centuries, Jewish society encountered successive empires, Persian, Greek, and Roman, each bringing new pressures and opportunities. The temple stood at the centre of life, yet new forms of worship and identity flourished outside its courts. Sects emerged, each offering a different vision of faithfulness to the covenant. Messianic hopes deepened as political and cultural challenges mounted. The life and times of Second Temple Judaism shaped the foundations of Rabbinic Judaism and created the religious landscape into which Christianity was born. Daily life in the Second Temple period reflected both continuity with earlier traditions and adaptation to changing realities. The temple in Jerusalem was the focal point of worship, pilgrimage, and national identity. Festivals such as Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot drew thousands of pilgrims from across Judea and the diaspora, filling the city with sacrifice, prayer, and celebration. Priests performed rituals according to Torah prescriptions, maintaining the rhythm of offerings that symbolized Israel's covenant with its God. Yet alongside the temple, synagogues began to emerge as local centers of worship and study. Originating in the exile and flourishing in the diaspora, synagogues allowed Jews to gather for prayer, scripture reading, and teaching even when far from Jerusalem. This development ensured that Jewish life was not tied exclusively to one location, a crucial adaptation that would sustain the people after the temple's eventual destruction. The diversity of Jewish society in this era was striking. Priestly aristocrats, landowners, and wealthy merchants lived in relative comfort, while peasants and labourers struggled with heavy taxation and economic inequality. Urban centres such as Jerusalem and Caesarea reflected Hellenistic and Roman influence, with theatres, markets, and baths, while rural villages preserved more traditional ways of life. Archaeological evidence reveals this diversity. Luxurious villas with mosaics and imported goods on one hand, simple dwellings and agricultural installations on the other. Yet through these differences ran a common thread of covenantal identity, expressed through dietary laws, circumcision, Sabbath observance, and festival cycles. These practices distinguished Jews from their neighbours and reinforced solidarity across social and economic divides. The sectarian landscape of Second Temple Judaism was one of its most distinctive features. The Sadducees, drawn largely from the priestly and aristocratic class, emphasized temple worship, rejected oral traditions, and maintained cooperation with political powers to preserve their position. The Pharisees, by contrast, emphasized Torah observance in daily life, including oral interpretations that extended the law into new situations. Their influence among the common people was significant, as they provided practical guidance for living faithfully under changing circumstances. The Essenes, likely connected to the community at Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, withdrew from mainstream society, denouncing the temple leadership as corrupt and awaiting divine intervention to establish true purity and justice. Another group, later known as Zealots, pressed for active resistance against Rome, convinced that political and spiritual freedom were inseparable. These groups often clashed with one another, reflecting deep disagreements over how to remain faithful in a world dominated by foreign rule. Yet their debates and differences enriched Jewish thought, producing texts, practices, and interpretations that shaped future Judaism. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide unparalleled insight into the thought world of Second Temple Judaism. Discovered in the caves near Qumran, these texts include biblical manuscripts, sectarian writings, and apocalyptic visions. They reveal a community obsessed with purity, law, and eschatological hope, convinced that they were the true remnant awaiting God's final victory. The scrolls also show the diversity of scriptural interpretation, with variants of biblical texts and creative commentaries that applied ancient prophecies to contemporary events. This discovery confirmed that Jewish scripture and tradition were not fixed, but were being debated, shaped, and transmitted in dynamic ways throughout this period. The scrolls demonstrate the vibrant intellectual and spiritual life of Jews under the shadow of empire, revealing both their anxieties and their hopes. Messianic expectations flourished in this environment of oppression, diversity, and longing. Some envisioned a king from the line of David who would restore sovereignty and justice, overthrowing foreign rulers and re-establishing independence. Others expected a priestly Messiah who would purify worship and restore the temple to its true holiness. Still others imagined dual messiahs, one priestly and one royal, working together to bring redemption. Apocalyptic visions depicted cosmic battles between the forces of light and darkness, with divine intervention ushering in a new age. These hopes were not uniform, but varied according to sect, region, and circumstance. Yet they reflected a common conviction that the current state of affairs, foreign domination, corrupt leadership, and social injustice, was intolerable and temporary, and that God would soon act decisively to fulfill covenantal promises. The diaspora played a critical role in Second Temple Judaism. By this time, large Jewish communities existed not only in Babylon, but also in Egypt, Asia Minor, and throughout the Mediterranean. These communities maintained ties to Jerusalem, sending offerings to the temple and making pilgrimages when possible, but they also developed distinctive forms of Jewish life in a Hellenistic world. The translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, known as the Septuagint, enabled Jews to preserve their traditions while engaging with broader intellectual currents. Diaspora Jews navigated the tension between assimilation and distinctiveness, participating in civic life while maintaining practices that set them apart. Their experiences enriched the diversity of Judaism, creating networks of influence that extended far beyond Judea itself. Roman rule intensified both tensions and adaptations. Heavy taxation, the presence of legions, and the appointment of unpopular governors fueled resentment. Yet Roman order also facilitated trade, travel, and cultural exchange, enabling Jewish communities to flourish economically and intellectually. The temple stood in greater magnificence than ever, thanks to Herod's expansion, yet it also became a symbol of contested authority, its priesthood seen by many as corrupt and complicit with Rome. The festivals that drew pilgrims to Jerusalem became occasions not only of worship but of political unrest, as large crowds provided fertile ground for protest and resistance. In this charged atmosphere, religious devotion and political aspiration were inseparable, and messianic hopes often took on revolutionary overtones. Everyday religious practice anchored Jewish life amid these upheavals. Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and circumcision remained non-negotiable markers of identity. Prayer, study of Torah, and synagogue gatherings deepened devotion beyond the temple, ensuring that piety was not confined to priests or festivals. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem was an aspiration for many, but the rhythms of household and community worship sustained faith for those far from the city. Ritual purity practices, including immersion in mikvaot, ritual baths, became increasingly widespread, emphasizing holiness in daily life. These practices reinforced a sense of continuity with the past even as the present world changed rapidly under imperial power. The intellectual and literary creativity of this period was remarkable. Wisdom literature such as Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon reflected on life, justice, and divine order in a Hellenistic context. Apocalyptic texts such as Enoch envisioned cosmic struggles and heavenly revelations. Historical works like 1 and 2 Maccabees preserved the memory of resistance and martyrdom, offering models of faithfulness under persecution. These writings reveal a community grappling with profound questions. How should one live under empire? How could covenantal promises be reconciled with suffering and oppression? What did the future hold for God's people? The diversity of answers illustrates the richness of Second Temple Judaism and its central role in shaping Jewish identity. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE would bring this era to an end, but its legacy endured. The debates among Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and others laid the groundwork for Rabbinic Judaism, which would emerge from the ruins. The messianic hopes and apocalyptic visions provided the soil in which Christianity took root. The practices of synagogue worship, Torah study, and diaspora adaptation ensured that Jewish identity could survive without temple or sovereignty. The Second Temple period was thus not only a chapter of history, but a crucible of transformation, producing the forms of faith that would carry forward into the next millennia. The life and times of Second Temple Judaism were marked by diversity, resilience, and creativity. It was a society both deeply rooted in its traditions and constantly adapting to new realities. It produced texts, practices, and hopes that transcended its own age. Though the temple itself would be destroyed, the faith forged in this era would endure, ensuring the survival of the Jewish people and profoundly shaping the religious landscape of the world. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE stands as one of the most cataclysmic and defining moments in Jewish history. The culmination of years of unrest, factionalism, and revolt against Rome. The temple, rebuilt after the exile and magnificently expanded by Herod, was not only the heart of Jewish worship but also the symbol of national identity, covenantal faith, and divine presence. Its destruction by Roman legions was more than the loss of a building. It was the collapse of a world, an event that reshaped Judaism forever. To understand this catastrophe, one must trace the deep currents of tension between Jews and Rome, the mounting resistance that boiled into open revolt, the bloody wars that followed, and the traumatic aftermath that forced the people to redefine themselves in ways that would carry forward into the centuries. The seeds of revolt were sown long before 66 CE, the official start of the First Jewish Revolt. Roman rule had always been a delicate arrangement, tolerated rather than embraced. The imposition of tribute, the presence of garrisons, and the appointment of governors, who often lacked sensitivity to Jewish traditions, created constant friction. Herod's reign had masked some of these tensions with prosperity and monumental projects. But after his death, Judea was fragmented, and direct Roman oversight intensified resentment. Governors such as Pontius Pilate and his successors frequently clashed with Jewish sensibilities, introducing imperial symbols into Jerusalem or mismanaging funds. The taxation burden weighed heavily on the peasantry, while the aristocracy and priesthood were seen by many as collaborators with Rome. Beneath the surface of outward order, anger simmered, waiting for a spark. Sectarian divisions within Judaism further complicated the situation. The Sadducees, tied to the temple and aristocracy, sought to preserve their status by cooperating with Rome. The Pharisees emphasized Torah observance and focused on daily piety, earning broad respect but avoiding direct confrontation with imperial power. The Essenes withdrew entirely, rejecting what they saw as corruption in temple and society, awaiting divine intervention. The Zealots, however, embodied a new spirit of resistance. Convinced that God alone should rule Israel and that submission to Rome was intolerable, they pressed for armed struggle. Their militancy resonated with those suffering under economic hardship and political humiliation. By the mid-1st century CE, the Zealot ideology had gained traction, turning religious devotion into revolutionary fervour. The immediate outbreak of revolt came in 66 CE, when tensions in Caesarea and Jerusalem exploded. Disputes over access to synagogues, sacrilegious acts by Roman officials, and heavy-handed taxation sparked protests that escalated into violence. The seizure of the temple treasury by the Roman governor Florus pushed the situation beyond repair. Rebels expelled Roman forces from Jerusalem, and Judea erupted in open rebellion. The initial victories of Jewish fighters, including the defeat of Roman troops at Beth Horon, gave the revolt momentum and fueled the belief that divine favour was with them. For a brief moment it seemed that the dream of independence might be realised again, echoing the memory of the Maccabees. Rome's response, however, was inevitable and overwhelming. The general Vespasian, later to become emperor, was dispatched with legions to crush the rebellion. He advanced methodically, capturing towns, securing Galilee, and cutting off supply lines. Josephus, the Jewish commander at Jotapata, who later became a historian of the war, was captured and defected to the Romans, providing invaluable but controversial accounts of the conflict. By 68 CE, much of Judea was under Roman control, but Jerusalem remained defiant. The city, however, was torn by internal strife. Rival factions of Zealots, Sicarii, and other groups fought one another as fiercely as they resisted Rome, burning food supplies and slaughtering opponents within the city walls. This civil war fatally weakened Jerusalem's ability to withstand the Roman siege. In 70 CE, Titus, son of Vespasian, led the final assault on Jerusalem. The siege was brutal, marked by famine, disease, and desperation. Josephus describes horrifying scenes of starvation, cannibalism, and internecine violence. The defenders fought with extraordinary courage, but the discipline and power of the Roman legions proved irresistible. After months of siege, the walls were breached, and Roman forces poured into the city. The temple, despite Titus's reported desire to preserve it, was set ablaze in the chaos. Flames consumed the sanctuary, gold melted into the cracks of the stones, and the great symbol of Jewish faith was reduced to rubble. The destruction was accompanied by slaughter. Tens of thousands perished, and survivors were enslaved or scattered. Jerusalem was left in ruins, its heart torn out. The fall of the temple was not merely a military defeat, but a theological crisis. For centuries, the temple had been the place where heaven and earth met, where sacrifice ensured covenantal relationship, where festivals united the people in worship. Its destruction forced a reimagining of faith itself. Without altar or priesthood, how could the covenant be maintained? The Pharisaic tradition provided an answer, shifting focus from temple sacrifice to Torah study, prayer, and observance in daily life. Synagogues became the new centers of worship, and rabbis emerged as the new leaders, preserving identity through law and learning. This transformation laid the foundation for rabbinic Judaism, ensuring survival without temple or sovereignty. For the Romans, the destruction of Jerusalem was both triumph and spectacle. The Arch of Titus in Rome still depicts the spoils of the temple, menorah, trumpets, and sacred vessels, paraded in a victory procession. The Flavian dynasty used the conquest to legitimize its power, celebrating the suppression of rebellion as evidence of divine favor. For Jews, however, the images symbolized humiliation and loss, reminders of a catastrophe that scarred memory for generations. The temple's destruction became the focal point of mourning, remembered in fasts such as Tisha B'Av, when lamentations recall not only this tragedy, but also earlier destructions and persecutions. The revolt did not end in 70 CE. Resistance continued in isolated strongholds such as Masada, where defenders held out until 73 CE, choosing mass suicide over surrender. Other revolts would follow in later decades, including the diaspora revolts of 115 or 117 CE, and the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132-135 CE, each met with devastating reprisals. Together, these uprisings revealed both the depth of Jewish resistance and the futility of confronting Rome militarily. The cost was staggering: lives lost, communities destroyed, and Judea increasingly depopulated and reshaped under Roman control. Yet from the ashes of destruction arose new resilience. The rabbis gathered in Yavne, preserving Torah, re-establishing communal structures, and laying the groundwork for Judaism's survival. Prayer replaced sacrifice, study replaced pilgrimage, and the home became a sanctuary. The loss of temple and land did not end Jewish identity. It transformed it. The very catastrophe that might have destroyed the people became the crucible in which a more adaptable and enduring form of faith was forged. The memory of the temple remained central, shaping liturgy, longing, and hope, but Judaism was no longer dependent on its physical presence. The Great Revolt and the destruction of the temple thus represent both devastation and rebirth. Militarily, it was a crushing defeat. Theologically, it was a crisis of unimaginable proportions. But historically, it was the beginning of a new era. Out of loss came transformation. Out of trauma came resilience. And out of destruction came a faith capable of surviving exile, dispersion, and centuries of empire. The temple lay in ruins, but the covenant lived on in new forms. The story of this catastrophe became not an end but a turning point, one that continues to shape Jewish identity and memory to this day. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and the crushing of later revolts mark the end of one era in Jewish history and the beginning of another. The loss of the temple, the dispersion of the people, and the suppression of national aspirations could have spelled the end of Judaism altogether. Yet instead of disappearing, Jewish life adapted, reshaped itself, and endured. Out of the trauma of defeat and exile arose a new form of Judaism, centered not on temple sacrifices or kingship, but on Torah, prayer, and communal life. This transformation is often described as the birth of Rabbinic Judaism, a movement led by sages and teachers who reinterpreted the covenant for a world without temple or sovereignty. Their work gave rise to the vast corpus of Jewish law and tradition that continues to shape Jewish life to this day. The immediate aftermath of the destruction left Jewish society disoriented. The temple had been the centre of worship, the heart of festivals, and the symbol of divine presence. Its loss forced fundamental questions. Could covenantal faith survive without sacrifice? How could sins be atoned for without altar or priesthood? What did it mean to be a people of God without land or independence? Different answers circulated in the chaotic years after 70 CE. Some still clung to hopes of revolt, as in the Bar Kokhba uprising decades later. Others withdrew into sectarian isolation, awaiting divine intervention. But a group of Pharisaic sages offered a different path, one of adaptation through Torah. They argued that the covenant was not dependent on the temple, but could be lived out in study, observance, and communal discipline wherever Jews found themselves. This vision allowed Judaism to survive not as a state religion tied to place and sacrifice, but as a portable faith rooted in law and learning. The reconstitution of leadership centered on Yavne, a coastal town where Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, a leading Pharisaic sage, reportedly secured permission from the Romans to establish a school. There, and in other centres that followed, sages gathered to preserve traditions, debate interpretations, and guide the people in a radically altered world. The shift from priests to rabbis as the primary religious leaders was gradual but decisive. Priests had mediated between people and temple. Rabbis taught, interpreted, and legislated, making Torah the new centre of Jewish life. This democratized religious authority in some ways, for study and observance were available to all, not just to those with hereditary priestly roles. It also created flexibility, allowing Judaism to endure in diaspora settings far removed from Jerusalem. At the heart of this new Judaism was halakha, the path of law and practice that guided daily life. Halakha extended Torah into every aspect of existence: family, commerce, prayer, purity, ethics, and more. In the absence of sacrifice, acts such as charity, prayer, and study took on heightened significance. The rabbis interpreted scripture creatively, sometimes expanding, sometimes restricting, always seeking to apply ancient covenantal principles to new circumstances. Their work was not abstract speculation but practical guidance, ensuring that Jewish life could continue in kitchens, marketplaces, and synagogues as much as in ruined sanctuaries. In this way, law became the vessel of continuity, a portable temple of discipline and devotion. The compilation of oral traditions was one of the most significant achievements of this period. For generations, teachings had been transmitted orally, debated in academies and households. After the destruction, however, the urgency of preservation increased. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 CE by Rabbi Judah the Prince, codified these traditions into 6 orders covering agriculture, festivals, family law, civil law, purity, and sacrifice. Though sacrifices were no longer practiced, they were preserved in memory and law, ensuring continuity with the past. The Mishnah did not end debate, but provided a foundation for ongoing discussion. Its concise, sometimes cryptic style invited commentary and interpretation, leading to the vast enterprise of the Talmud. 2 great centres of Jewish learning emerged, one in Palestine and one in Babylonia. Each developed its own Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, with the latter becoming the more influential. These monumental works preserved not only legal rulings but also debates, stories, ethics, and theology. They reveal the dynamism of rabbinic thought, where disagreement was preserved rather than suppressed, and where interpretation itself became a sacred act. The Talmud embodied the principle that the covenant was not static but living, unfolding in the interaction of text, teacher, and community. This approach ensured adaptability, allowing Jewish law to address new circumstances across centuries and continents. Alongside law, prayer took on new centrality. The rabbis developed set prayers to replace sacrifices, ensuring regular worship in synagogues and homes. The Amidah, or standing prayer, became the heart of daily devotion, recited morning, afternoon and evening. Psalms were incorporated into liturgy, linking ancient tradition with new forms of worship. Festivals continued to be celebrated, now oriented around synagogue rituals and family observance. Passover Seders, for example, evolved into structured meals combining scripture, ritual foods, and storytelling, ensuring that memory of Exodus remained alive without pilgrimage sacrifices. The rabbis thus created a rhythm of life that sanctified time, transforming daily and yearly cycles into a living covenant. Ethics also played a central role in rabbinic teaching. The rabbis emphasized acts of kindness, justice, and humility as essential expressions of covenantal faith. The world stands on three things, one teaching declares: on Torah, on worship, and on acts of loving kindness. This ethical emphasis ensured that Judaism was not reduced to legalism, but remained a way of life oriented toward holiness and compassion. Stories of sages modelled humility, patience, and wisdom, offering examples for communities navigating the challenges of exile. These teachings reinforced the conviction that holiness could be lived out in every setting, not only in temple courts, but in fields, workshops, and marketplaces. The rabbinic movement also provided frameworks for coping with trauma and loss. Rituals of mourning, fasts commemorating the destruction of the temple, and prayers for restoration preserved memory without paralyzing hope. The rabbis taught that every synagogue, every home, could serve as a sanctuary. They insisted that study of Torah was equal to all sacrifices, transforming learning into an act of worship. In this way, the community could carry forward its identity even in dispersion. The covenant was no longer tied to land or state, but to a way of life that could be lived anywhere, from Babylonia to Rome, from Alexandria to Spain. Over time, Rabbinic Judaism became the dominant form of Jewish life. Other sects, such as the Sadducees and Essenes, disappeared, swept away by war and exile. The Pharisaic tradition, reshaped through rabbinic leadership, provided the continuity that endured. The messianic hopes that had fueled revolts were reinterpreted, with emphasis shifting from imminent political restoration to long-term divine redemption. The rabbis discouraged rebellion, focusing instead on survival through piety and study. This stance preserved the people through centuries of foreign rule, allowing Judaism to outlast empires and to maintain its identity across the diaspora. The shaping of Jewish law during this period had consequences far beyond survival. It created a system of thought and practice that integrated tradition and adaptation, continuity and innovation. The Mishnah and Talmud became not only legal codes but cultural treasures, shaping language, imagination, and identity. They anchored communities in common rhythms, even when scattered across the globe. They ensured that memory of the temple and hope for restoration remained alive, while also providing tools for daily life in exile. Through rabbinic law and teaching, Judaism became one of the most resilient and enduring faiths in human history. The beginnings of rabbinic Judaism thus represent a remarkable achievement. Out of the ashes of destruction, the rabbis forged a new path, one that preserved the essence of covenant while adapting to radically changed circumstances. They shifted the focus from place to practice, from sacrifice to study, from priesthood to teaching. In doing so, they ensured that Judaism would not only survive but thrive, capable of enduring dispersion, persecution, and change without losing its core. The story of rabbinic beginnings is therefore not only about law, but about resilience, creativity, and faithfulness. It is the story of how a people, facing the loss of everything they had known, found in Torah and community the strength to endure and the vision to carry their covenant forward into the future. The story of the Israelites did not end with the fall of Jerusalem, the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt, or even the disappearance of the temple that had once stood as the visible heart of their faith. In many ways, these cataclysms marked not an end but a new beginning. With their land devastated, their political sovereignty extinguished, and their holy sanctuary reduced to ruins, the Jewish people entered an age of dispersion that would last millennia. This diaspora, though born of trauma and exile, became the setting in which Jewish memory and identity were preserved, reimagined, and carried across continents. What emerged was not the disappearance of a people, but the astonishing endurance of a faith and culture that adapted to every circumstance, while never forgetting its origins. The enduring legacy of Israelite history is the testimony of how a covenantal identity could survive displacement, how memory could become a homeland, and how faith could outlast empire after empire. The first centuries of diaspora life were marked by scattering. After the Roman wars, large numbers of Jews were enslaved or resettled in Italy, North Africa, and other provinces. Communities already existed in Babylon, Egypt, and Asia Minor, but the destruction of Judea added new depth and urgency to life outside the land. Synagogues became central institutions, serving not only as places of prayer and study but also as community centres, courts, and schools. Archaeological remains of synagogues from this era, decorated with biblical symbols such as menorahs, shofars, and palm branches, testify to the resilience of identity and the centrality of shared symbols that linked dispersed communities to their heritage. The synagogue was more than a building. It was a portable sanctuary, a reminder that wherever Jews gathered, their God was present, and the covenant remained alive. Memory became the lifeline of diaspora existence. Rituals and texts preserved the story of the people, binding past to present. The recitation of the Shema reaffirmed daily loyalty to the one God of Israel. The Passover Seder retold the Exodus from Egypt, reminding each generation that liberation and covenant were at the core of identity. Fasts, such as Tisha B'Av, lamented the destruction of the temples, weaving trauma into liturgy so that loss was never forgotten. These acts of memory transformed history into living ritual, ensuring that even in the farthest reaches of dispersion, Jews remained bound together by shared narratives and hopes. The land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem continued to dominate imagination, prayed for and longed for even when inaccessible. In this way, memory itself became a homeland that no empire could destroy. The rabbis, whose beginnings we have already seen, provided the framework for sustaining life in diaspora. Through the Mishnah, Talmud, and subsequent commentaries, they created a world of law, ethics, and interpretation that made the covenant portable. Every household table became an altar, every community a sanctuary, every act of study a continuation of sacrifice. This vision allowed Judaism to flourish without territory or temple, rooting identity in practices that could be carried anywhere. Over time, Jewish law, halakha, became not only a guide to daily life, but also a barrier against assimilation, a way of maintaining distinctiveness amid diverse cultures. It enabled Jews to live in Babylon, Rome, Spain, or Yemen, while remaining part of a single people bound by covenant. Diaspora life was not without hardship. Jews often faced suspicion, persecution, and restrictions. Accusations of separateness or disloyalty made them targets in many societies. Yet the very structures of rabbinic life provided resilience. Study houses replaced courts, synagogues replaced sanctuaries, and families became the core of transmission. Torah scrolls and memories travelled where armies could not reach. The covenant endured not because of kings or armies, but because of communities that carried it in their practices and prayers. This endurance was itself a testimony, shaping the view that Jewish survival was not merely historical accident, but evidence of divine faithfulness. Over the centuries, diaspora communities developed distinctive cultures, reflecting both adaptation and continuity. In Babylonia, Jews flourished as scholars and merchants, producing the Babylonian Talmud that became the cornerstone of Jewish law. In Alexandria, they engaged with Greek philosophy, creating works such as those of Philo that sought to harmonize Torah and reason. In later centuries, Jews in Spain, North Africa, and Europe would contribute to philosophy, science, poetry, and trade, while preserving their traditions. Each community was unique, yet all were bound by memory of Zion, prayer for restoration, and adherence to covenantal law. This ability to live in many lands while maintaining one identity became one of the most remarkable features of Jewish history. The enduring legacy of Israelite history also lies in the way it shaped the religious landscape of the wider world. Christianity emerged out of the diversity of Second Temple Judaism, carrying forward messianic hopes, scriptural traditions, and ethical teachings. Islam, centuries later, recognized the Israelites as people of the book, acknowledging their prophets and scriptures. The influence of Israelite traditions, monotheism, covenant, law, prophetic justice, spread far beyond the boundaries of the Jewish people, shaping civilizations across the globe. Yet for Jews themselves, the legacy was lived not in abstract influence, but in the daily discipline of memory, ritual, and hope. Jerusalem remained the symbolic center of this enduring story. Even in ruins, it occupied the heart of prayer. Daily liturgy turned toward the city. Weddings concluded with the breaking of glass, a reminder of the temple's destruction. Festivals included prayers for return. The refrain, "Next year in Jerusalem," captured the paradox of diaspora existence. Rooted in foreign lands yet oriented toward a homeland remembered and longed for. This hope sustained generations, allowing identity to endure not as nostalgia, but as living expectation. The covenant was never imagined as broken, only as awaiting fulfillment in a future restoration. The adaptability of Judaism in diaspora also ensured its survival through countless trials. Empires rose and fell. Rome, Byzantium, Persia, Islamic caliphates, medieval kingdoms, but Jewish communities endured. Sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted, they carried forward their traditions with remarkable tenacity. They established academies, wrote commentaries, composed poetry, and engaged in trade. They experienced golden ages and dark times, yet always preserved their memory and identity. The enduring legacy of Israelite history is precisely this resilience, the ability to maintain continuity without sovereignty, to remain distinct without isolation, to live in dispersion without dissolving. At the same time, the memory of loss and hope for restoration gave Jewish life a unique character. Suffering was never merely personal, but part of a larger story of exile and covenant. Hope was never merely private, but bound to the collective destiny of the people. This sense of shared memory and future created solidarity across distances and centuries. A Jew in Babylon, one in Alexandria and one in Rome, could feel connected through prayer, scripture, and ritual. This unity in dispersion testified to the power of identity rooted not in land but in memory and covenant. The enduring legacy of Israelite history can be seen not only in survival but in creativity. Rabbinic literature, poetry, philosophy, and commentary turned exile into a source of insight and reflection. The absence of temple and sovereignty did not stifle thought but stimulated it, producing a tradition rich in interpretation, debate, and ethical vision. The covenant was no longer embodied in kings or sacrifices, but in words, ideas, and practices that could be renewed in every generation. This shift ensured that Judaism remained dynamic, capable of responding to new circumstances while remaining faithful to its core. In reflecting on diaspora and memory, one sees the remarkable arc of Israelite history, from patriarchs to prophets, from monarchy to exile, from temple to synagogue, from land to diaspora. The people continually adapted without losing themselves. Their history became not just their own, but part of the heritage of humanity. influencing religions, cultures, and philosophies across the globe. Yet, at its heart, it remained the story of a people bound to their God by covenant, carrying memory as their homeland and hope as their future. The diaspora, far from erasing the Israelites, ensured their survival. Memory, far from being mere nostalgia, became the foundation of identity. And the enduring legacy of their history is the testimony that faith, law, and covenant can outlast empire, exile, and destruction. The Israelites became the Jews of the diaspora, but their story remained continuous, a living thread woven through centuries of change. In their survival, the world has witnessed not only resilience but the enduring power of covenantal identity, a legacy that continues to shape history, faith, and imagination to this day.